Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to the Treasury Select Committee, our second session today as part of our inquiry into the budget and the comprehensive spending review. We're delighted to have before us the Chancellor of the Exchequer and two other witnesses. And Chancellor, I think we all know who you are, but I will very briefly ask Dan and Conrad, please, to just introduce yourselves for the public record. Thank you.
I'm Daniel Smith. I'm the Director of Strategy, Planning and Budget in the Treasury.
Right.
Well, Conrad Smying, I'm the Director of Public Spending in the Treasury.
Great, welcome, and welcome to all three.
Thanks for having us.
Of you, a pleasure. Can we talk about fiscal targets, Chancellor? So we've had a session this morning with Richard Hughes, and he described after the budget, when it comes to your fiscal rules, he described it as a white knuckle ride. There is a very useful table in the OBR report, chart 1.9, that looks at the kind of headroom that you've got against your two major fiscal targets, the net debt target and the deficit target. And what it shows is that compared to other chancellors with their fiscal targets, your headroom looks rather pale by comparison. And the chart also shows that in terms of the average forecast error within these reports, those errors are potentially very large compared to the headroom that you've actually built in to your fiscal targets. So he didn't say, not a cat in hell's chance, but it does look like there's a strong risk that those targets will not be met. What would you say to that?
I think, well, factually, obviously he's right about comparing these headrooms to previous headrooms that have existed. I think the typical headroom under previous chancellors, flow targets have been about 0.9% of GDP and probably 1.7% of GDP for the stock target. The target with the headroom we've got is lower in the first target year, which is the third year of the forecast. Obviously, you'll know that it's a rolling target, so that moves forward over time where the numbers slightly improve. So that will be helpful. But I don't dispute his factual correction. If you look historically, there is slightly less headroom than previous chancellors would have had. Not though I think less than Philip Hammond had, less than George Osborne had first time around, but not less than George Osborne had, I think, in 2015 from memory. But he would have the precise numbers.
Yeah, very similar to one of the ones 2015, a bit more than 2015.
I think probably, Chair. The other thing, just on your last point, and Dan might jump in. I can't recall, but I think actually they did some modelling where they run some simulations about the percentage likelihood of meeting different targets, and those numbers are also in there.
55 and 60%.
Yeah, which I'd probably describe as better than cat and hell's chance, but the numbers are the numbers.
Okay. So if it goes wrong, so when you have your sleepless nights, and you have used that expression in the past, particularly in respect of inflation and interest rates, what are the possibilities out there that you think could cause problems to you meeting those targets? What are your top sort of 4 or 5 things that you feel need to go the right way in order to meet those fiscal targets?
Well, one thing that is obviously broadly within our control is spending, and I think the advantage we have now relative to previous budgets when people have set fiscal rules is this is being set at the same time as a multi-year spending review. So Conrad is nodding alongside me, so he will hopefully agree. But at least this point forward, we have fixed budgets for the next 3 years, and that gives us an enormous amount of certainty compared to previous fiscal events on the spending side of the equation, right? So we've just spent a long time with departments figuring out what do they need for the next few years. So on the spending side of things, actually, we should have
and on
that degree of uncertainty compared to previous times should be less.
On that point, are you concerned that there are a number of departmental pressures out there that might emerge that can't be known at the moment? For example, Charlie Bean, in the evidence he's just given to us, pointed to transport. Now, we don't know to what degree the patterns of transport demand go back to what they were pre-pandemic, and if they don't, a lot of these rail and bus networks and everything else are going to need further bailing out.
Yeah, so as you would expect, we've had quite a long time to prepare for this multi-year spending review, and we've had the ability to sit down with departments in detail, and that's what Conrad and his team have been doing extensively, to think about all the known risks, do our best to quantify them, come to a kind of shared view of what we think an appropriate amount of risk tolerance is, where the central case modelling should be on things exactly as you described, without getting into all the details. The shortfall in rail income, which obviously we have taken into account in all these numbers. So that should be there for everything that we know about, and there should be a margin against that as well. We wouldn't expect us to run things completely to the bone, so there's an appropriate amount of margin that would be built in for departments to manage around. Hopefully some things also just go our way. The risks hopefully are not all asymmetric to the downside. But I think you asked more broadly. So on the department side, obviously we would have taken care of hopefully most of those things. Obviously there are things that pop up. There's contingency built into all the spending numbers, as there always is, reserves and contingencies built in, both on the revenue and on the capital side, to deal with the bumps in the road. And then more broadly, you asked about, or maybe I'll finish there and then.
Well, no, I'd like to invite you to keep going, actually. So this is what sorry about the risks that there are. So I'm thinking about, we're not at the end of the pandemic, so that's something we have to worry about. Labour markets, clearly, there are issues there. Supply chain bottlenecks, inflation, interest rates. So just be very interested, I think the committee would be interested to know what your thoughts are around those kind of issues, what weighs on your mind the most, and if there's something in the list that needs to be added to the things that
Well, I'd say on the things that can be negative risks, I've talked about them in your committee and elsewhere, and they're well flagged in the OBR's report. Obviously, the risk from higher inflation and interest rates is well known, well flagged. That you can see the financial impact of increases in rates, both at the short and the long end, and inflation are all documented in the OBR's report.
And can I just ask on that point, so if inflation takes off in a way that we hope that it doesn't, if it's mainly wage inflation and you've frozen the thresholds for income tax, etc., there's lots of fiscal drag, which means the Exchequer actually does quite well on the tax side out of that, albeit it will have negative impacts elsewhere in the public finances. So if it's coming through wages rather than, say, product-based inflation, which would not have the tax take elements to the same degree, what do you think of that sort of scenario? Do you think that's something that is very, very unlikely, that wages are going to start to get into a wage price spiral, or are you thinking at the back of your mind there's a possibility this could happen, and what would be the fiscal consequences of it?
Well, again, Dan might want to chip in. I think the economy is very complicated. Its interaction with the fiscal numbers is also very complicated, and as we go through these processes, there's lots of different moving parts. So I think it's probably difficult to say just this, this one thing will lead to this particular outcome. In general, as the OBR have pointed out, the public finances are quite sensitive on the debt side and the financing of the debt side to changes in RPI, because we have a relatively large stock of inflation-linked debt, about 25-26% give or take, which is about double the G7 average for historic reasons. So we're particularly sensitive to that. And then generally the rest of the financing the government has to do would be impacted by the market interest rates for refinancing debt as they come up. The short end of the curve impacts particularly the asset purchase facility, and I think again we've talked about this before in this committee, the interaction between quantitative easing, the asset purchase facility, and our public finances. Again, it's been documented by the OBR in the March EFO, explains how changes in the short end of the bank rate negatively impact the interest that we receive, interest coupon that we receive. So those are the kinds of ways that it impacts the public finances.
So Dan might have just looked up the box that I think I've got in my head, which is the inflation box. They play around the central case, and there's an upper case which has, I think, going up to 8%, and then of course there'd be an interest rate response to that unknown, but they have to make an assumption on that. On that basis, actually, fiscally, inflation isn't quite as dangerous as it might otherwise look, is that? And I just wondered whether that was how you saw it.
I mean, look, in general, the government's objective, as restated to the Bank of England just last week, is for low and stable inflation, and they have a good track record in meeting that target over the last 10, 15 years, and one would expect them to continue meeting that target, because for all the reasons that we've settled in this country, that is a good thing, and it would not be a good thing to have persistently high inflation.
Yeah, okay. And other issues such as labour market issues, immigration, have we got our approach to that right in terms of bringing skills in, should we need them in the shorter term?
Yes, I mean, well, as it relates to particular supply chain challenges, we've obviously the government has made some flexibilities available, whether it's on the HGV side, on the agricultural side.
Have they done enough? It seems that
Well,
number 10 is quite insistent that we don't reach, quote, for the uncontrolled immigration lever. But
yeah, I think, I mean, in a
that
macro sense, that's obviously right, having had all these debates about that. But in the short term, I think there is an obvious desire for pragmatism and to ease some of the challenges where we think it can make a difference. As again, the Transport Secretary would probably be better placed than me to give you an up-to-date sense of where we are on that process, and ditto the Agriculture Secretary on the seasonal agricultural workers scheme for exact take up on those relative to where where the availability of those visas are. The one thing that we've done on our side and in the budget in spring and then reiterated last week was on the high skill migration side. And this actually talks about driving up long-term productivity and growth in the economy, where we are keen to ensure that our visa regime for high-skill migration is internationally competitive. And at the spring budget, I announced together with the Home Secretary a series of reforms to our innovator visa, our global talent visa, the creation of a new high-potential individual route, and a scale-up visa, and a global mobility visa as well for companies to move people here. At the budget last week, we outlined further details on the scale-up visa, for example. Originally a recommendation from Ron Khalifa, who did a review into fintech for the government. It was one of his recommendations, and what this visa essentially does is say if you're a fast-growing company, not limited to fintech, but just broadly a fast-growing company, so it could be in life sciences, for example, as well, and that's your eligibility criteria, then you have the ability to bring people at a certain skill and salary level much more easily into your company and in an attractive, internationally competitive way for them. So that, actually we announced the details of that last week, and on that side I think we're making quite a lot of progress to have in place by next spring, so a year after they were all announced, all of these reforms enacted, and I think the impact of a small number of very productive people will be positive for the economy.
Okay. And just look at my list here, so supply chain bottlenecks. I think you've often, quite correctly, I think, made the point that a lot of this is outside of our control. What happens in Southeast Asia is not something that we can reach into and fix. What elements of it are inside our control, and what can we do about those elements that are more within our control when it comes to supply chain bottlenecks?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the HGV side. I mean, what are some of the things we can do? We can ease the bits that government is responsible for, so that obviously, again, not my direct portfolio responsibility, but whether it's the testing requirements, making sure that we streamline that process, move people through the system as quickly as possible, provide regulatory easements where we can, all of which Transport Secretary has done. Last week we also announced funding alongside the industry to improve the quality of facilities at truck parks.
Can that be done
at
pace?
That's obviously what obviously we've provided the money. We would like it to be spent at pace, but that the exact timing of that will be a function of how quickly people can build things and all the rest of it.
Okay.
We're very happy to provide the money at pace.
Okay. Which neatly brings me on to R&D. So R&D, I think, Chancellor, you announced in the budget that the 22 billion target would move from 2024-25, would slip 2 years, basically. What lay behind that decision? Was it a fiscally motivated decision, or was it a case of you can provide money but you can't get it out the door necessarily quickly enough, and therefore you've reprofiled it for that reason?
I'd say it's a mix of everything. In the round, we're doing a lot of things. The capital budget in aggregate, I'd start there actually. So our capital budget for the SR period is the highest, well, represents the highest level of sustained capital investment that this country's seen in about half a century. So the overall pie for spending on capital is large by historic standards. That said, there are lots of calls on that pie, whether it's other types of economic infrastructure like roads, rail, broadband, etc., net zero, social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, prisons. So it's just balancing all of those things together, making sure that the pounds you spend are going to be well spent while still delivering on our objectives. I think it's worth, if we hadn't ever mentioned 22 billion, what would people see? They would see 20 billion representing the largest amount that any government spent on R&D in this country. They would see a 50% cash increase between the start of the Parliament and the end of the Parliament, which would represent the largest cash increase.
Understood. But what was it that drove you to
part of it is making sure I could meet all these things. So it represents a very large increase, the largest amount that any government spend. On the key priorities of the science and innovation community, we can meet those objectives, which are making sure that we can associate with Horizon and the funding is there to do that. Secondly, to ensure that core research gets very generous settlements, which we announced anyway in the spring, and those are being honoured in full, which is important for basic research. And then thirdly, the later stage R&D, the innovation side, we wanted to make sure that incremental funds were able to go there, and they have. So Innovate UK's core budget by the end of the Parliament, Conrad, correct me if I'm wrong, will be about £1 billion, which is not quite a doubling, but close to compared to...
I just wonder why the road back, the 2 billion road back, if it was right to have that target before and then the target's been shifted, what changed?
Well, it's just the balance between all these things. Right, yeah. But again, I'd focus on, this is what that £20 billion represents. It's a very strong investment in research, innovation, and driving our future growth. The other thing I'd say is it's worth comparing it, benchmarking it internationally, as people often do with R&D, and alongside the 22 billion target, which we have maintained, was a desire to get to 2.4% of GDP, which is the OECD average, by the same year, the 26-27 year. If you look at what we'll be doing at the end of this Parliament, if you combine, as the studies and the statistics do, our public and direct investment in R&D and our fiscal support for R&D through the tax system, which you obviously need to do, it's all taxpayer money one way or another, it will represent about 1.1% of GDP in aggregate. The current OECD average is about 0.7. The US,
do you think
the US is around that level. France and Germany a little bit higher. So again, if you're looking at the 20 and saying, well, is that a good amount for a country that wants to be a science and technology superpower? If you look at those numbers, you'd say yes, it is. It's internationally very strong investment in our future innovation.
Some people would say R&D, so tax reliefs around R&D are not the same actually as putting in public funds to R&D, because of course some of that research and development that companies will claim against, the relief against, would have happened anyway. Do you accept that point?
Well, the international statistics are done in a way that looks at all of them, because ultimately it's fiscal support, right? All of that is taxpayer money that is being put into the system to support R&D. Now, I think you're absolutely right to say, are you better off spending £1 on direct investment rather than on a tax credit? That is an absolutely fair question. And
what would you say that the dead weight was on R&D?
Well, it depends on the scheme. I think if you look at the figures internationally, we are an outlier in the amount of our fiscal support that comes through tax credits versus direct investment, right? So big picture, top down, to answer your question, you might look at that and say, these guys seem to think that, for the pound that they have, they want quite a bit more of it in tax credits rather than direct investing compared to everybody else. Now, we looked into this, as I mentioned in the budget speech, and there's clearly not working particularly well with our tax credit system, which other independent commentators have alighted on, and indeed the chair of the Science and Technology Committee wrote a foreword to a report that highlighted this, and I think actually the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury has also highlighted it as well. If you look at what HMRC tell us is being claimed with regard to R&D tax credits, you get one number, which is kind of £45 billion worth. If you then look at the other set of accounts of what's being spent in this country on R&D, it's considerably less than that, in the mid to high 20s. Now, there are some measurement differences, but that's still a very big unexplained gap. Now, part of that is because we allow people to claim for a tax credit on activity that doesn't happen in this country. Now, that obviously is not a good use of taxpayer money, and we are an outlier in allowing that, so we've said that we're going to fix that. More broadly, to your point, we have different schemes in our R&D tax credit system, and one thing that we want to look at is what are the other reasons for this big gap between the numbers I mentioned, and are there things that we should be doing differently to make sure that taxpayers' money is more effectively supporting what we want, which is R&D here in the UK that drives economic activity, and to your point, that is additional. Now we have two schemes, RDEC and the SME scheme. Dan might have the numbers to hand, I can't remember the top of my head, but the RDEC scheme is for every pound we get £2 or £3 worth of value, whereas for the SME scheme we get far less than that. So even between the schemes we have, the degree of additionality is much greater in the RDEC scheme than the SME scheme.
When we look at business investment generally, there's some concerns about SMEs in particular. Are they concerns that you share, and if so, what in particular are you looking at doing at the SME level of things?
Do you mean SME investment in general?
Yes.
Oh, in general?
General business, no, not R&D.
Not R&D, general business investment.
I've now flipped to
yeah,
investment. Okay,
fine. So if we're, I've got those numbers somewhere. Anyway, but we'll get, but we've got, anyway, your point on the additionality, we'll get you the two numbers. On SME investment, what we have done is, the budget actually took action on this, was the thing that SMEs use for investment first and foremost is the annual investment allowance, which is a very easy to use, essentially full expensing for capital investment. It's broader than the super deduction.
Were you disappointed that the OBR said it wouldn't really make any material difference to the path of business investment? Your latest announcement on the annual investment allowance, the extension of the...
Well, I mean, let's see. I think these things are hard to know. They've also, in general, revised up their investment expectations in this forecast relative to the old one. But in order to try and support those businesses, this is the tool that we have that, at least from the feedback.
But do you think the OBR's got it wrong when they say it won't make any material difference to the path?
On all the things, they're independent forecasters. They're going to reach their judgments, and that's how we do these things. Obviously, I think it could make a difference, and particularly at a time when, to your point, we want to make sure that we continue supporting business investment at this stage of the recovery. One might want to take a slightly more generous approach to it. That might not be true at all times, but at this particular time you might want to err on the side of generosity, even if it is not the most overwhelming, compelling evidence that it was going to be transformative. It certainly, probably on the margin, is helpful. And that limit currently is £1 million rather than 200,000, and it was due to end at the end of the year, and we've extended it all the way to March of 2023. And it's, as I said, it's broader than the super deduction because it covers second-hand assets and leased assets, and it applies to a broader range of people, for example, unincorporated entities. So that is probably the best thing one could do. The other slight things we've done, which again are probably helpful rather than completely transformative, but are things that business groups asked us for, was to use the business rate system to incentivise investment. And we have done two things there, again, both of them suggested by a range of different business organisations, and essentially create two different investment reliefs, where there is relief against business rates for particular types of investment. And the two that we have, one is an improvement relief, where so someone adding a floor to a shop, or adding rooms, or putting in CCTV or bike rack, for example, any type of improvement.
Just because we're a bit tight on time, Chancellor, and it's all highly relevant. The
yes, to your question.
Making.
Well, that and the green relief together are worth about £750 million, and again, were things that were asked for.
You looked at this budget, and the upside was that the OBR's forecast had improved a lot since March, so you had more to play with. You then had to take a decision as to what you did with that extra fiscal space, if you like, and you spent quite a lot of it. Departmental budget increases across the board. You've elected to go for certain fiscal targets to make sure there's some margin and headroom within that. You did cut some taxes, and you mentioned one of them with business rate relief. There was also alcohol duties, the taper, which I was very pleased to see instead, the taper change for universal credit. Why didn't you go further on the tax cutting side of things at this point, compared to leaning into spending quite so much? Well, when you're quite tempted to do a bit more on that?
Well, I think we started this talking about fiscal headroom not being as much as previous chancellors, so you start with that as one constraint, and then I guess your question is, given that
spend versus tax.
Yeah, so we've got a bunch of commitments that we want to deliver. I'm sure we'll get into in the rest of this committee some of the things that people would rather we were doing more of on the spending side, but we wanted to deliver on all those key commitments, And we've done that, I think, across the board with what are historically generous spending settlements for all departments, and making sure that not only do we deliver strong public services, that we're doing that in a way that levels up across the country, but also invest in our future growth by doing things like investing in R&D, as we've discussed, in innovation more broadly, but also in skills and in infrastructure. And that is a key part of what the government promised it would do, and at this moment in time we believe that was the right thing to do.
Okay. Chancellor, thank you very much. Can I go to Emma, please?
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome, Chancellor. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, Emma.
You'll have to, I'll apologise up front, my questions are all slightly disjointed, but therefore they should enable nice, quick, super quick answers. So the first one I want to ask you is related to the Money and Pension Service, actually, which I know the Treasury have oversight of policy of. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Hull is currently the UK's debt capital. We have more people with the highest rate of unpaid debt in the country. It's more than double the national average. So this is a quick question, really. The Money and Pension Service are looking to move their support for debt advice to virtual, to call centres and away from face-to-face. Now, I wondered what your thoughts were on removing that face-to-face support for people in debt at a time when we're seeing such high levels of debt in the country, personal debt.
Was that, and forgive me, was that something that was announced in the budget?
It wasn't announced in the budget.
But it's a general question.
Yeah, the Money and Pension Service, I was told that they engage with the Treasury on policy matters relating to debt advice.
Okay, I don't have a specific answer for you. In general, on the debt side of things, I think actually we discussed it last time I was with you all, Breathing Space is the main initiative that we've put in place, which again with a lot of engagement from Parliament about that model. My colleague John Glenn has been leading the charge on that, and that I think is providing actually support to people, giving them a breathing space to help restructure debts. That's probably the biggest thing I could point to. With regard to the specific operational decision about face-to-face versus virtual, I'm happy to get back to you. It's not something that I have a view on their rationale for. I mean, more broadly across the public sector, whether it's DWP or others, there have been some moves during the pandemic to virtual, and obviously we're getting back to a more normal situation now. But trying to grapple with people's desire to work hybrid and use the advantages that virtual interaction can also bring, whether it's appointments at different times that otherwise might not be possible. So I couldn't comment sadly on the rights and wrongs of it and what it's designed to do and what's driving it.
That's absolutely fine. I thought it was worth a try, Chair. And I've written to the Chancellor about that individual matter. But on the issue of remote working, I wonder if I can draw your attention to something which I thought was really exciting, which is actually being done in Ireland right now. So in March, Ireland announced plans to move home working to shift workers from the cities to more rural areas, this big decentralisation push. They talked previously in the early 2000s that they tried moving departments, which I know that's something that your government have done, but they found that delivered far fewer jobs to the regions than originally expected. So instead, they're looking at what they've called an unparalleled opportunity exists for us to realise the objective of achieving balanced regional development and maximising recovery for all parts of the country by moving many civil servant jobs to being remote only and setting up regional hubs. And they're also looking at offering tax incentives for businesses that want to relocate to other areas of the country. Now, I know you've spoken many times about levelling up and your belief in it and your keenness to share jobs around the country. I wondered if this model that's being done in Ireland right now was something that you were looking at and as potentially a model that could work for regions in the UK.
So I'll have to go and look at the actual details, Emma, before I can tell you whether it's something that we either are doing or might do in the future. I mean, we have an existing, the tax system already provides tax relief for people with some of their home working expenses, actually. So that, I might get down to spend a minute on that, but we have an existing tax relief in the system that already does that. And in terms of moving jobs outside of London, which sounds like they're doing, obviously, the Treasury is very much a believer in that. We've opened a campus in Darlington where we're going to be joined by several other departments. And so far, that has, I think, surprised on the upside in terms of what else it has catalysed. There have been other bits that are either related to government or other bits of government that have now expressed an interest in joining us, which I think is great. So it's not just going to be us and a couple of departments. There are lots of other people, the names of which I don't think are public, so I can't quite say yet. But so that I think is good news. If you talk to people in the local area, there's also very clearly an enormous amount of interest from businesses and other organisations to now start opening offices in and around the area so they can be close to what this economic hub is. So again, it's very early days, obviously, but I think it's a clear demonstration of our intent to do this. And again, interestingly, because lots of people assumed that if we were going to do something like this, we would go and do it in a big city, and we didn't do that with this.
Yeah, it's still obviously based on where you're physically relocating offices. What they're doing in Ireland is they're moving 20% of their 300,000 civil servants to remote working and setting up regional hubs. So rather than it being based around an individual location, they're actually basing it around.
It's probably a different, in the sense that a regional hub is an office where people can come and work some of the time in a hybrid fashion, which is probably not in London. So I don't think it's that dissimilar, given that we operate a hybrid model anyway. In particular at the Treasury, as Dan and Conrad could probably rather painfully describe to you, we haven't had enough desks for several years. So hybrid working is nothing new at the Treasury, because on any given day people are working like that anyway. So that is, in any case, how we work.
Okay.
And we have the regional hub that I think that they're trying to get to. Next
time when you come back to us, if you're able to say whether or not you really looked into this model that Ireland are doing and whether you think it would be appropriate to the
great.
That would be brilliant. I'll now move on to the questions I was going to ask, Chair, which are related to health and social care tax measures. I mentioned earlier on today when we had the OBI in front of me that my constituency straddles East Riding and Hull. East Riding rural Conservative, Hull urban and Labour, both of them saying to me, please can you help desperately lobby the Chancellor for the problems we have around adult social care. And in fact, I'm sure you're aware the leader of the Conservative and East Riding Council has written to yourself in regards to this matter. So of the revenue raised by the levy, so the levy now, only 18% is going to go towards adult social care in the next 3 years. And given that social care is widely considered to have been underfunded for years, do you think these measures go far enough?
Yes, I think it represents historically very high levels of investment in social care in general, and obviously also funds a landmark set of reforms that the Prime Minister talked about when he was first elected on steps of Downing Street, and we are now enacting. If you look at what we further announced at the spending review last week, on top of the health and social care levy funds, there was an extra £1.6 billion a year in cash grant money that is going to go to local councils. And that has been, I think, warmly welcomed by this sector, and obviously how they spend that will be up to them, but the key pressures they face are on the social care side. And what they were nervous about, what they told me, was this health and social care money, that's fine, that's to fund this set of reforms, but we still obviously have day-to-day challenges and demographic pressures that we're grappling with. There's so much we can do on efficiencies, there's so much we can do obviously through council tax, but then also if you can provide further money centrally, that's helpful. And the £1.6 billion a year I think is significant, and it will ensure that core spending power, which is the best metric to look at for kind of the resources that local government has available to it, will grow over this spending review period by around 3% in real terms, which represents historically quite high levels of growth.
Yeah, on the issue of social care, I raised this in questions recently, that there were no social carers available in the whole of the Conservative and East Riding for my constituent who needed it. There's obviously a dire situation. They're competing against organisations like Amazon, who are offering to pay people a lot more than people are getting in adult social care. So do you think you're going to be looking at raising the levy rates again to manage this increased demand, which, as you said, demographically is not going anywhere for adult social care in the future?
I mean, it doesn't feel to me like that would be necessary in the forecast period that we have. What I would say about the workforce, though, I think you raise a good point. I mean, historically, one of the things that we've not done as well as we could have done with the workforce is making sure that there is a real sense of career progression and qualifications that people can get. And what the health and social care money will go to, or some of it will go to, about £500 million will go to exactly that. It will go to improving the quality of the training that we are able to give the workforce, provide a sense of career development, certifications that are recognised across the board. And again, Health Secretary is the best person to ask on exactly the detail of how that will be implemented. But I think that will help to address some of the recruitment and retention challenges that the sector has had, and particularly on the retention side, actually. And these, this £500 million of investment, if we get it right in doing all of that, should massively help on the retention side. Obviously, I talked about the 1.6 billion as well, and obviously the national living wage announcement from last week, which is probably disproportionately affects people in this industry, is being put up at a reasonably significant rate next year, 6.6%, which will represent £9.50 an hour and £1,000 extra a year.
Thank you, Ted. My last question is, with the current demand and the difficulties in adult social care, which is felt as the example I gave, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, whether it's labour conservative, these concerns are felt right across the country. Do you think the funding that you're offering for adult social care right now is going to be enough to meet the demands in the next year?
Yes, I mean, we talked about this before. We sit down with every department. That's what Conrad's team does. And we go through exactly on adult social care. There's quite a complex model that we go through with the Department of Health and Social Care. We look at the demographic pressure. We look at all the various challenges. We look at what's reasonable from an efficiency and productivity improvement perspective. We look at what council tax can raise. We look at the gap. That's why we've provided £1.6 billion a year, which is a very significant amount of extra cash funding going into local authorities, largely to fund some of the challenges in social care. And that is all in additional to the money raised from the levy, which is going, as I said, to workforce and to fund the reforms.
Yeah. And I sincerely hope you're right. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Alan. Can I just pick up on that? But health spending's gone up and up and up. 32% of public spending, I think, about 10 years ago, 42% today. Health always comes back and asks for more. How can you be so confident that that particular department is going to be happy enough and content through to the future with the amounts that you're providing?
Well, I think, Emma's questions are all about social care and making sure we have enough money for social care, which, as I said, on the plans that we've put out, £1.6 billion goes direct to local authorities. It's not going to the NHS, it's going to local authorities. Obviously, we also have something called the Better Care Fund, and part of the idea here is, and again, better for the Health Secretary to talk about this than me, but having more integrated approach to how we deliver social care on the ground, and the Better Care Fund is an example of that. Will lead to better outcomes and make sure the money is spent well. Now, to your broader point, obviously we've set out a set of plans. We've generously funded the NHS, not just for the elective backlogs, but generally as well, with a growth rate in real terms is something like 3%. That is obviously quite a generous growth rate. And I think it's given we've had a conversation quite a lot about tax in the last few months, with the health and social care levy in particular, and people's focus on it, I think people would rightly say, hang on, we're now actually paying more and contributing more to the system, whether it's the NHS or more generally. It's absolutely reasonable that we make sure that that money goes as far as it possibly can. We want every pound to be really well spent, and given we're all asked to pay more, I'm sure the NHS and the Health Secretary's talked about this, is going to work really hard in driving up productivity and effectiveness so that money is well spent.
So there was a kind of cri de coeur, as I saw it, Chancellor, within your speech about spending all this money, which was that at some point you want to get taxes down, and you also talked about the extent to which individuals and society should keep looking to government for all the answers, which seem to speak about the size of the state, which after all big events like wars and pandemics that we have has tended to grow, remain large and continue to grow, and we've got the demographic changes that are also driving that. How confident are you that that vision that you presented in your budget is achievable?
I mean, I'll point you to the words I said at the end of the budget. That's very much my goal, my mission over the remainder of this Parliament. And we took a step in that direction at budget. So it's not just words. We cut taxes for millions of the lowest paid people in the country. So we're already making progress on that journey. But the other thing I said in the middle of the budget, which is pertinent to this, is a focus on delivery, on outcomes, on effectiveness. It's all very well to sit here and talk about billions of pounds here and billions of pounds there. This money needs to actually make a difference on the ground. It needs to transform people's lives. We've got a very strong focus as part of the spending review that Conrad's team have put in place about how do we do performance evaluation, how do we drive performance in departments, what are the metrics, what are that we're using to measure that, what are the outcomes we're seeking to achieve. The Prime Minister, as you know, has set up a new delivery unit to help with that.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you saying you think that in the budget you took a step towards reining back the size of the state, even though you are talking...
No, cutting taxes. I was talking about
cutting taxes.
Taxes.
You're referring to, right.
So I view the universal credit...
It's not a tax cut, that's a benefit change.
it's
It's
one
not a
combined
tax cut.
approach to how people look at it.
It's a change in the
Ultimately, it puts
taper on
more money-
universal credit.
Right. Order. John.
Sorry,
okay.
Chair.
I've hogged too much of the time as it is, I think, and it is usual that I will go to next.
Thank you. Apologies,
next
Chair.
in, so that's
That really isn't a tax cut. You're just desperate to find a tax cut. We're sitting in the Margaret Thatcher room, and you hope to emulate her, but the British Prime Minister and the British Tory government that you are most emulating at the moment is Ted Heath's. Low growth and therefore high tax. Is that not the case?
Well, no, actually, we're forecast this year to grow at what are historically very high rates as we recover from the pandemic. I think the OECD has us growing faster than most.
It does feel a bit anemic further out in the forecast.
It returns back to the trend that we had before the crisis of around 1.5%. But I think actually what you'll see is we're investing at a set of record rates in an effort to drive up those growth rates. So whether that's through R&D investment that we talked about, through infrastructure or skills, we're doing things that on a scale that haven't been done before. And my hope and expectation is that will actually translate into higher growth down the line.
In my experience, people are generally happy to pay their fair share, if it's their fair share. So in your budget, the national insurance increases will cost a care worker £140 a year more, a nurse £310 more a year, and a paramedic £420. Meanwhile, banks who have recorded record profits are set to save £4 billion in taxes by 2027. In the words of my late mum, isn't that yet another example of much gets more?
No, I disagree with that. So let's take the national insurance point first. So when you're raising that amount of money to fund the NHS and social care, which we've just been talking about, you really only have three taxes that you can go to. Right? There is income tax, national insurance, and VAT. Now, VAT, I think most people would say is the most regressive of those. And given your question, let's just rule that out. Then you've got a choice between national insurance and income tax. And anyone who tells you that there's another way to raise what in the end ended up being kind of low teens billions of pounds, I don't think is being honest or credible, because there really isn't. But so you're down to two choices, income tax or national insurance. My view, there's no perfect way to raise money. Right? Raising taxes is not not an easy thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do, and we'd rather not do it. So there's no good way to do it. There's just probably least worst ways. The advantages of national insurance over income tax primarily are that...
That's not my question. My question is, how can you put up national insurance for the least well-paid at the same time as cutting taxes to banks who have record profits?
So, first of all, how else do we raise the money to fund the NHS? There are two choices.
Perhaps you don't cut the bank's taxes to the banks to make a
taxes
contribution.
on banks are going up. Actually, the taxes on banks combined with corporation
but you are
and surcharge
cutting
is going
tax
from
on
27.
banks to the effect of £4 billion by 2027.
I think it is. No, actually, I think the impact of the surcharge change in isolation is several £100 million. But you have to look at the increase. You can't just look at that in isolation. You have to look at that combined with the fact that the core underlying corporation tax on banks is going up from 19% to 25%. So banks are going to pay more corporation tax in the future than they did in the past.
But less tax surcharge.
The composition of that surcharge, that's obviously changing, and I said that at the time,
so
right? Because if your surcharge rate is going up, we're resetting the surcharge.
You're going to cut the tax surcharge profits on Barclays Bank from 8 to 3%. This is a bank that made a pre-tax profit of £6.9 billion in the first 9 months of this year. What they also did in this year was close the branch in my town centre. And now they have a van outside once a week where all the long-standing customers who helped made their profits over the years have to queue in the cold, while the lease on their branch has 3 more years to go. And those people have to make an appointment online. They don't use online banking. How fair is that?
Well, so go to access to cash is a pretty separate issue, which I think we've spoken about before, and you've obviously had my colleague John Glenn here talking to you about this as well. We actually have plans to legislate if it's required for access to cash. What we have done in the interim is a set of agreements, particularly with the post office. I haven't got the stats in front of me, obviously, because it wasn't part of the budget last week, but where the vast majority of people are within range for the vast majority of their banking provision from a post office rather than a bank, and you're seeing banks actually pull together to provide community to hubs as well. But as I said, we think cash is important, access to cash is important, and whether it's through the post office or through the access to cash legislation, we're prepared to go further if required. But again, it wouldn't be right for me to comment on individual banks, but in general, the rate of tax that banks are paying is going up from 27% previously to 27%.
And the taxpayer has stood behind the banks when they needed that support. I think it's about time the banks stood up for their most vulnerable customers. If we turn to cladding, what does government support to remediate unsafe cladding not cover buildings below 6 stories? And how much do you estimate the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding in those buildings to cost?
So again, obviously it's not my specific policy area, so you'll forgive me. What I can tell you is the advice we've got, and I think from the Building Safety Committee, about where the most acute risk is, and that's why the funds that we have put aside are directed towards that, and that's £5 billion. And I think actually over time, there's various select committees that have put various numbers out there, which this is very much in keeping with. That's £5 billion of support to remediate the most dangerous buildings. That's been provided for in the spending review, alongside a tax, the residential property developer tax, which we previously announced and consulted on, which will be brought in to help fund some of that, but not all of it. It will raise about £2 billion over a decade, and that will be levied at a rate of about 4% for developers with profits over £25 million, and it captures 20 or 30 or so from memory. But where the resources are going, and they're considerable resources, £5 billion, will go on remediating the buildings which are least safe, which are over 80 metres. And below that, again, it's not my particular area, but my understanding is the expert groups on building safety have provided some guidance there about what's appropriate, and again, working with the banks on the EWS1 forms and those things as well.
Last week, former Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick described his battle with the Treasury over cladding remediation, despite the government repeatedly insisting that it would be wrong to expect leaseholders to pay. Can you confirm today, as indicated by Mr Jenrick, that the government's position is that anything above the £5 billion currently available should be paid for by leaseholders?
What we've put aside, actually working with Robert when he was Housing Secretary, is looking at where the risk was, what were the sums required to remediate buildings in that risk, and the sums that were provided were the £5 billion, which is a very significant amount, more than many people were actually asking for, targeted, obviously, as I said, on those buildings where there was most acute risk.
The top 10 executives and shareholders of Britain's largest house builders have personally pocketed more money since the terrible fire at Grenfell than their firms have set aside to fix the cladding crisis. Meanwhile, housing associations have allocated 6 times more to building safety than developers, and London and Quadrant Housing Trust has even made the decision not to develop in London because of their risks on cladding. This is a problem that can't go away. Someone's got to pay for it, so who's that going to be?
It maybe missed the answer to my previous question, your previous question, which is we introduced at this budget the residential properties developers tax.
Yeah.
Again, without naming names, I don't know the overlap between the people you're looking at, but I would imagine many of them are captured by this. It is a new tax levied on the profits of large developers.
The richest and the biggest.
It's the biggest, 20 to 30, also from memory down, right, it's 25 or so, I think, give or take, on profits of over £25 million. It's been extensively consulted on with the industry. Actually, it was someone from the industry that suggested that we should do this as well. And it will raise around £2 billion over a decade is what we've said, and
so
that
is
will
the
help.
£2 billion in addition to the £5 billion?
No, that will help pay for some of the £5 billion.
Okay, so it's going to cost more than £5 billion. So who pays for the rest?
The rest is paid as with everything else. But there is also a new... Again, we're straying into territory that is not my portfolio responsibility, but I know that the Housing Department are bringing in also, as you all know, because this is an area of particular interest to you, a new charge on high-rise buildings as all part of the new building safety regime. So there's additional regulatory intervention there, but beyond that, this will come from the regular source of funding.
So young leaseholders who bought their properties because it was the only thing they could afford as first-time buyers, there's no easy answer for them. They're going to have to stamp up.
No, I mean, as I said, if they're in a building which is unsafe, as defined by the guidance that we've got, there's £5 billion available to remediate those buildings, and that work is already underway.
Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Angela, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Afternoon, Chancellor. Your rhetoric about having a high wage economy wasn't really borne out by the OBR's analysis on living standards, if we have a look at it. In the 16 years since 2000, from 1992 to 2008, real wages went up by 36%. In the OBR forecast show that in the years between 2008 and 2024, we can expect a grand rise of 2.4%. How on earth does this square with your optimism about having a high wage economy?
So, Angela, you're absolutely right on the numbers, and in common with many other countries around the world, post-financial crisis, people have seen a slowdown in productivity, and then accompanying with that, with increases in real wages. That, you know, we're not alone in experiencing that. I think what gives me confidence are a couple of things. I think one, we've taken quite particular action to improve wages at the bottom end of the wage spectrum, because that is something which is in our direct control, and that's through the living wage policy, or national living wage policy, which has obviously last week was increased 6.6% for next year, £9.50, £1,000 pay rise for people
I think
full-time on
it's
the national living wage.
accepted, Chancellor, that you've because of that policy, you have there's a more progressive element to raising the wages of the lowest paid, although what I'm really talking about are wages in the aggregate across the economy as a whole, and there you've actually delivered stagnation, haven't you? Stagnating real wages, and the increases in inflation, which is increasingly going up, 4.4% according to the OBR, are threatening to take away even the progress in real terms that is made on wages in the last year or two.
Yeah, I think it's probably... It's not right to gloss over what's going on with lower wages, because a lot of the numbers that you pointed to leading up to 2008, a lot of that wage growth was not very evenly shared, actually, and that was one of the challenges with it. So, you know, it's all very well to say, well, great, here's all this high wage growth. We had that, but it turned out it was a lot of people at one end of the income spectrum benefiting from it. So now, actually, if we're focused on those at the lower end of the spectrum, I don't think that's a bad thing, and it's something that we should celebrate. Also, there was a report just last week that said the proportion of people in the UK on low pay was, I think, the lowest it's been since 1997 or 8 from memory, right? So I think actually that is 98. I think that is a good thing, and we should celebrate that, because not all wage growth is equal. And if I had lots of lovely wage growth numbers, but it was all accruing to the bankers that Siobhan was talking about, we'd probably be talking about that instead, right? So, look, wage growth for low-paid people is a good thing, and it's good that it's happening. You're absolutely right. Wages more generally since the financial crisis here and in other countries, it's been a struggle for them to reach some of the growth rates we saw previously. My firm view is the best way to change that is to provide people with the opportunities to get the skills, the retraining they need to have well-paid jobs, right? That's what the economics would tell you, that's what common sense would tell you. And, you know, what can I tell you? I can say that in the spending review we delivered last week, the investment in skills and I think that's important, because the stat you should have in your head is about 80% of our 2030 workforce is already in work, so it's all very well doing things at schools and everything else, but the chunk of people are already working. So we've got a real terms 26% increase, cash terms 40-something% increase over this Parliament in skills, and that is tackling every which way we know to try and improve people's skills, which should lead to higher wages for them.
Well, I don't disagree about having to tackle those skills, but your 42% increase in money for skills and education doesn't compensate for the 50% cut that there's been in those budgets since 2010. So I think, you know, we're at the least, we are just getting close to where we were 11 years ago, and there's that period of austerity where things have stagnated in between. So, you know, I hope that our skills do go up, but at the same time there's been this problem. I was looking as well, thinking about people's standards of living. You accept that they're going to be under great strain in the next few years. You accept that people's standards of living are going to be under great strain in real terms in the next few years, with inflation going up and wages effectively on average stagnating.
Let's look at someone, we can go through the numbers, right, for those particularly on the lowest incomes for whom these things make the most difference. Actually, next year, you know, because of the increase of the national living wage, if they're on universal credit, they'll benefit from the significant reduction in the taper rate. You know, they will actually have significantly more
so long as they're working.
in their pockets.
If they don't work, by the way, they don't get anything and they end up considerably worse off. And not everybody who can't work, it's not always their fault that they can't work. I'm
not saying it is, but we have a
policy.
So
there's no hope for them, is there?
Yeah, well, we have a policy that's focused on, we just started this conversation talking about wages, right? And so, unsurprisingly, that accrues to people in work. So the best way to help them, as I said, is we can cut the taper rate on universal credit to make sure that work pays. We've raised the national living wage to make sure that work pays. And there is a plethora of opportunities available for people to help them get new skills, to retrain, to upskill, all of which we know will improve their ability to earn more money. And I think that is the right thing to do. And is it going to happen overnight? Of course, these things don't happen overnight, but we're putting in place all the things that are required to enable there to be better wage increases for people over time.
I mean, one of the things that has squeezed people's real living standards is the increase in the tax take. I think the Resolution Foundation calculated it at £3,000 per year since 2019 at the last election. Do you accept those figures?
I think those figures, Dan will correct me, the way they did those combined lots of different taxes, which were not all necessarily directly levied on individuals. And I think the other thing that analysis brought, not that particular one because I haven't gone through it in detail, but more broadly, analysis like that, it only looking at one side of the ledger, Angela, and you of course would know, we can look at the taxes, and yes, people are paying more. They're going to pay the new health and social care levy. No one is pretending otherwise, right? That takes money from people. That's why I, in an ideal world, prefer not to have to put taxes up on people. But you do get something for that money, right? It's all very well to just look at the taxes without looking at what you're getting. And on that particular thing, what are people getting? Well, they're going to get the fact that, you know, them or their family member is going to wait less for an elective surgery that they've been waiting to have, or they're going to get a better experience of social care. So you can talk about living standards by just looking at the tax side. I think that's probably slightly unfair because people's quality of life is also, and I think I'm sure you would appreciate this in particular, also influenced by the quality of the public services that they get, especially if they're more reliant on them. And because of the significant investment in public services that those taxes are paying for, as you can see in the distribution analysis in the budget, it is a highly progressive set of measures, which mean those on the lowest incomes and the lowest deciles are the ones that are benefiting disproportionately more than everyone else of what we're doing. So I think that is a way to help people.
I mean, that depends on the expenditure being good value for money and being done properly. We have the National Audit Office report on the £37 billion spent on test and trace, which says that this organisation was using the public purse like a cash machine. We have the £27 billion in fraud in the coronavirus schemes that is likely to have gone on, and I appreciate there's more reason for that to have occurred given that we were in an emergency situation. But those of us who wish the state to do things and public services to be properly supported want public money to be spent properly. Do you admit that there's an issue with this?
I completely agree with you that people should expect and demand that their money is spent properly. And you and I talked about this when I was last here, and you're absolutely right to focus on it. I focus on it. We focus on it as a department. I do think it's slightly unfair to focus on COVID schemes that were put in place in a time of national crisis at enormous speed, and I can tell you...
I admitted that, Chancellor.
No,
Perhaps you could talk to me about test and trace then, and the
I can't, because I'm not the minister responsible for it, so I can't talk to you about it in detail. But more generally, and all the times I was in front of you and in Parliament during coronavirus, nobody, not a single person, including anyone from the PAC or anyone else, was putting their hand up in standing up in any of those question sessions saying, no, please can you go a bit slower, Chancellor? Actually, what we really want are more checks, because we want this money to take longer to get to people, right? So I think on the COVID side, that is what it is, obviously. And I said at the time, when you're in a crisis, you're going to end up casting the net wider than you would in peacetime. But where you're absolutely right is, now we're through that, right, and we're focused on the day-to-day stuff. You're absolutely right to push me. Everyone else should push every department. I'm pushing every department, because as we've talked about, the state is taking a lot of money from people. We've talked about the tax take being high. We've talked about the state doing a lot. It is absolutely right that that money gets spent really well. I want to see that. You want to see that. People who are paying taxes and looking at us to deliver for them expect it rightly. So you can rest assured that I am doing my best to hold departments to account to deliver on all these things. That's the benefit of a 3-year spending review. And it may be worth just 1 minute, because we have spent a lot of time on this, for Conrad to explain to you all the various things we're doing, because we've put in place a new framework and a new way of doing this that I started working on with Conrad when I was Chief Secretary.
Perhaps he'd write to me, because I've got another question for you, and that is, we've been talking, with all due respect to Conrad, we've been talking about the ending of the tax lock. And the taxes that you put up, which was in your manifesto. Could I just ask you a question about the ending of the pensions triple lock, which was also a manifesto commitment that you've reneged on? How much will the Exchequer save by taking that triple lock into a double lock?
I think
Chancellor?
It's Dan, 4 billion. The difference is about.
So it's about £6 billion a year with
I
a
think
credit.
you'll find it's 30.5 billion over the next 5 years.
Yeah, well, we because we have a target for a particular fiscal year, we tend to look at the impact in that individual year. You wouldn't accumulate the pension that people are going to receive. So the annual figure is about 6 billion. That includes moving to a double lock for the pension credit. That number is higher than people might have expected had they looked at the spring budget. Now that's partly because of the way the OBR construct their forecast. So their forecast assumes that it will rise in line with average earnings, because that's the highest figure in the triple lock, and so it's the saving relative to that. However, compared to the spring budget, the saving is smaller than that, because in the spring budget they already had a higher forecast than 3.1%, which is what inflation is in September, which is what the double lock will therefore mean it rises by. They already had some cost from being above 3.1% in their spring forecast.
It comes to £2,300 per pensioner that you're going to be taking off them permanently because of disapplying the triple lock in 1 year. If you look at the table in the OBR report, page 203, it goes up to as high as 6.7 in 2026-27, and that's just with applying it for 1 year. There are going to be some pensioners, Chancellor, that have a really tough time next year because of rising prices and the fact that they're not going to get an up rate that you promised them in your manifesto. What can you say to them?
So, and you may have a different point of view to me, but we were talking about, Siobhan was talking about working age people, young families, people starting out. We had a situation where the statistics that determine earnings growth were completely distorted as a result of furlough, composition of the labour market before and after the pandemic, and the very rapid reopening after a very rapid fall. Everyone, universally, not political, acknowledged that the statistics were not objectively sound basis to be making decisions on. Right, that was not just me. I've got a list here. I could read through them about multiple different organisations that all said the same. So in that context, we had a decision: do we go ahead and apply the triple lock in a way that it was clearly not meant to be applied, and award people a number based on a number that we know to be wrong and false. And then that would mean that we'd have to find that billions of pounds from somewhere else, or not spend on whether it's the NHS or schools or something else, or R&D, as the Chair was asking, whatever it might be. And I didn't think that was right. I didn't think that was fair. And I think most people would accept that that was not fair, actually. And whether it was the Institute for Government Resolution Foundation, the Social Market Foundation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, former pensions ministers, the Institute of Economic Affairs, I can go on about people who all thought it was a completely reasonable and fair thing to do. We didn't scrap the triple lock in its entirety, as some people actually said we should. We just temporarily moved to a double lock, which does exactly the thing that you were asking about. It protects people against rises in the cost of living, because the double lock gives you the benefit of inflation or 2.5%, and obviously it's higher than 2.5%, so that's what pensioners will get. And I stand by that decision. I genuinely believe that is the right and fair thing to do.
Saves you 30 billion in the next 5 years.
It's not about, and that money has been used for all the things that we've been discussing. And if we didn't have that money, then either the headroom that we started this conversation with being lower than anyone else would be even lower, so there'd be even more risk, or indeed we would not have been able to spend, more likely, on all the other things that we've spent on, or taxes would have gone up. So I thought this was actually a reasonable and fair thing to do. And with regard to pensioners, what there is already is lots of other support for pensioners that comes through the system, whether it's the winter fuel payments that are worth almost £2 billion a year to help with energy bills over the winter period. There's the NHS prescriptions, which are worth, I think, several £100 million from memory, bus passes, etc. So there's lots of other support for pensioners separate to the state pension, and actually pensions relative to earnings in this country are the highest they've been in over 30 years. So the actual level of the state pension, because of the triple lock, which has been in place for the last 10 years and notably was not in place before then. Let's just remember the triple lock was put in place after 2010 and executed. Before then, pensioners, you'll remember because you were in government then, Angela, for the beginning of the Labour government, they just had inflation, right? And then it moved to a double lock. For the bulk of the Labour period, it was just a double lock, inflation or 2.5%. So because pensioners have benefited of something better than that since 2010, pensions relative to earnings are now, as I said, the highest they've been in something like 33, 34 years. And I thought this was absolutely a reasonable and fair thing to do in the circumstances. You might disagree, fair enough. I think it was 100%
I was merely
the right
trying
to
get you to talk to us about how much money you'd save by making that decision, and it's 30.5 billion. Finally, you chose not to cut VAT on gas and electricity. And when questioned on why, you said that such a cut would disproportionately benefit people in large houses. But you then you've frozen fuel duty, and doesn't that disproportionately benefit people who drive big cars? Why the one and not the other?
Not to the same extent, and I think fuel duty is something that actually benefits people very, very broadly, and it's obviously a smaller amount than freezing VAT. Or reducing VAT on energy. And again, I think freezing fuel duty was a helpful thing to do to ease with the cost of living. It's something that people think makes a difference to them, and in that sense is widely supported. Again, not something you may believe in, that's fair enough. I thought it was the right thing to do in the circumstances of inflation that we've been seeing and doing our bit to ease the cost of living. I do believe that a VAT cut on energy would not be a sensible thing to do. And again, that's not just me saying that, that's whether it's the Resolution Foundation, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, I forget whatever tax policy institute that was looking at it, all of them have said that it means that the bulk of that very expensive tax cut, which is worth over £1 billion, would go to the wealthy. It's not a well-targeted policy. I think our approach of creating a £500 million household support fund where money can go directly to the 3 million most vulnerable families in the country and help them with their energy bills, I think that is a lot better use of cash than a massive tax cut that benefits predominantly wealthy people. And it's not just me saying that, it's all the independent people saying that as well.
And if high energy prices persist throughout next year, will you be looking at this again, or is that it as far as
I wouldn't comment on future policy now, Angela, you know that. But as I said, we put policy in place now that will help whether it's with the Household Support Fund, whether it's with the Universal Credit Taper Rate Reduction, which puts considerable amount of extra money in people's pockets next year. And there is existing support for energy bills already in the system, which you'll be familiar with. The Warm Homes discount provides about £140 rebate on about 2.2 million vulnerable families' bills already. That's already built into the system. The winter fuel payment we talked about, up to £200-300 for about several million pensioners. We have the cold weather payment, which if temperatures really drop means an extra £25 a week for about 4.1 million vulnerable families. And there's something called the Energy Company Obligation from memory, which helps about 300,000 people a year in fuel poverty with upgrades to their homes, with insulation, energy efficiency measures, generally saving them about £300 to £350 each. So that, there are 4 other things that we do anyway at the moment to help people with energy bills.
Thank you,
Could I just add on fuel juicy that lower income people tend to drive older cars. Older cars are much less fuel efficient. So actually, it tends to be better off households that have new fuel efficient cars or electric vehicles, and therefore freezing fuel duty is quite progressive in terms of its impact on household costs.
Okay. Thank you.
In Glasgow.
Right. You can't please everybody all the time, can you? Harriet.
Chair, thank you. Can I just come in very, very quickly on the sort of macro inflation theme? And we heard from Sir Charles Bean this morning. He was reminding us about the bond market collapse in 1994 and the loss of confidence and the rise in interest rates then. He was pointing to the scenario in the OBR reports for the really bad inflation outcome, which is quite a reasonable risk to your forecast. And he actually quantified it in terms of the next 2 years. It would cost the Treasury an extra £60 billion. So I just wondered, in your Plan B, Chancellor, what you would do if that unfortunate turn of events occurred.
Harry, you have to forgive me because I didn't see Charlie's evidence earlier, so I don't know exactly what he was referring to. So, was he just talking more broadly to a situation where inflation was wildly out of control, or
in their scenario in terms of inflation, they have a central scenario and then they have a risk scenario, and in that risk scenario, he quantified the cost to the public purse over the next 2 years of that risk scenario as being £60 billion.
Okay, look, I don't know exactly what went into that. So, look, clearly, inflation. We started the conversation. I completely agree with Charlie. Inflation, persistently high inflation, is obviously a risk to the economy. That's why the remit for the Bank of England is low and stable inflation. And I would expect them, as I reiterated that remit by writing to them last week, and I would expect them to continue to do what they have done over time, which is meet it. So hopefully we can have some confidence in that. And on the fiscal policy side, we've thought about that as we've put together the policy. So, fuel duty on the margin, helps keep the cost of living down. It does something, and where we can make sure that fiscal policy is not going to lead to that scenario. That is something that we would have in mind. But I can't, talk to you specifically about that scenario and what we might do in that scenario. But £60 billion is obviously a very significant amount of money.
But so what I'm hearing is that there isn't a specific Plan B that you have. You're obviously hoping that it doesn't happen. £60 billion will be a lot of money.
I think you would expect us to think through lots of contingencies as we would, and that's part of the reason to have headroom towards in fiscal rules. It's partly why you have fiscal rules that are met on a rolling basis rather than a fixed basis, right? To allow you to adjust to short-term changes in the economy and the economic cycle. Like some people might say, well, you should have fixed rules because they're stricter and more credible. So that the benefit of a rolling rule is it allows you to manage some short-term challenges if you need to. So those are some of the things that we put in place. We constantly keep an eye on it. There are levers that obviously we can deploy, things like the national living wage and other things which we can do on an annual basis or beyond. But as I said, Bank of England has got a good track record of managing this. On the things that they are responsible for, we will make sure fiscal policy is doing its bit as well. And I'm reasonably confident that we can do a good job of those things.
Okay, great. Just to the chair's questions at the beginning, it would depend what drove those. In the OBR scenarios, they point out that if it was more on the labour side, so it was wages, then that in the medium term could be fiscally positive. It would depend what the driver was and the persistence.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to dip in various sections.
So, Chancellor, when you took the decision to freeze those thresholds around income tax, were you thinking in terms, to a degree, of a hedge against future inflation on the fiscal side? Because that will be the consequence, according to the FDR.
That is, but I think I was very transparent about that decision in the budget in spring. I went out of my way to explain the rationale for it in the budget speech. It was a measure that, what it has going for it is it's incredibly broad-based. It is.
No, I understand all that.
Yeah,
I just wondered also whether you would have thought,
if
inflation really takes off and it's wage inflation, then actually the public finances won't be hit badly in the medium term. It'll be a positive.
That measure is not going to make up for 60 billion quid. So I think that, if to Harriet's point, I don't think that could be a driver for that policy. But that policy is a progressive policy. It was described as such by everyone. It's broad-based and it builds over time, which is what you want to support an economic recovery. So I think So I think at the time people recognised it as being a sensible way to do what we needed to do.
Okay, thank you. I think it might yet prove very helpful if wage inflation takes off to your numbers, actually.
Well, as you said, there is a natural link.
Significant.
That wasn't the driver for the policy.
Understood. Thank you. Rationale.
Good afternoon. Chancellor, I just wanted to focus my questions on the overall tax burden. I know some of it's already been touched on, and also the taper rate. So in your speech, you said that your goal is to reduce taxes, and the OBR has said that the tax burden is forecast to increase to the highest rate since Clement Attlee. Now, Clement Attlee had a lot to show for his tax increases in the form of the National Health Service, which we continue to benefit from, education and the welfare state, and much else. What do you have to show for the tax burden rising to the level that it has? And is it comparable to the ambition of the post-war Clement Attlee government?
Well, I mean, you talked about two things, right? You talked about education, you talked about the NHS. I mean, that accounts for a good chunk of where the money goes on the NHS.
The catch-up jar set out a request for about 15 billion. The amount that you've invested nowhere near is that. So.
Yes, it's £5 billion, and again, you might want to cut the pie differently, Rationale, right? So that's totally reasonable. What I'd say is the reason the tax burden is very high is because we're spending a lot on lots of different things. So I think no one can disagree that the pie is really large, and you might say, well, I want to spend even more on catch-up, but you've got to point to the bit that you're going to spend less on, which I don't know if you had.
Perhaps as Siobhan was talking about, the 4.5 billion in the banking sector, the tax break you gave them. Is that a fair way to allocate resources?
I don't think that comes anywhere close. The tax rate on banks is going up. Right, so actually they're going to be collecting more from banks than we were previously, because the tax rate on them is going from 27 to 28. But what do you get for it? So on catch-up, £5 billion, it's obviously a very significant investment in catch-up. What is it doing? It's doing a few things. The things that I would focus most on are the areas where the evidence points to there being the biggest effect on kids' learning, and that is teachers and tutoring, small group tutoring. Now, all the evidence that we've been through would tell you that if you do small group tutoring, that can have a really beneficial effect on people's ability to learn faster. There is just a delivery constraint on how much tutoring you can do, because you've got to hire people, they've got to be able to deliver it properly, and we have broadly maxed out on that amount of what we can do. And then secondly, on the teaching side, again, there's a delivery constraint on how many teachers could you provide extra CPD for, extra mentoring for, particularly in the early stage of their career, and we're maxing out on those things broadly as well. Those are the best evidence we have. And then separately, there's money going into increasing the number of hours post-16, and then just broadly premiums that are delivered to schools to use slightly in their discretion. So
thank you, Chancellor.
And on NHS, probably, which is important because you mentioned it, and Attlee obviously you're right to highlight that.
But he established the NHS. I mean, you
yes,
and
it
fix
continues.
the underinvestment that we've seen.
Yeah, he established it, but I don't think when he set it up, he probably envisaged the demographics that were going to be in place 60 years later. Nor did he envisage a pandemic, which meant that the backlog for the NHS was reaching unacceptable levels. So where is this money going? This money is going to reduce the backlog to help us catch up with millions and millions of operations, and it's going on coping with the demographic pressures in a wealthier society demanding more from its healthcare system.
So I think what I'm trying to get at is, given we've come out of a pandemic, or coming out of a pandemic, the choices you're making, and some of the longer term pressures on the economy. We talked earlier this morning about productivity, the hit on productivity from Brexit in the long run of about 4%, and also the pandemic-related costs of about productivity hit of about 2%. When you add up these things, including the tax burden that's increased quite dramatically, should the British people be confident that the measures you've put in place in terms of taxation and expenditure, and given what's happened, both in relation to Brexit consequences as well as pandemic, that we are set in the long run to make up for the losses in the economy and productivity on your watch in terms of the plans you've put in place?
So I think, look, already people can see that the plan we put in place is working. A year ago, people were saying unemployment was going to be 12%. Now the forecast is for it to be around 5% at peak. That's 2 million fewer people out of work than previously forecast. As the OBR said, they described our interventions as remarkably successful in their words. I did see some comment from this morning that they were positively surprised by how successful of our interventions had been. So I think people can take some confidence from the fact that what we've done over the last 12 to 18 months has averted what could have been a very significant outcome in the labour market, and indeed on scarring. A year ago, and even more recently, the OBR believed that scarring, as did others, would be 3%. That has now been revised down, and you've talked about what's the long-term damage of these things. Are our policies making a difference? Well, clearly they are, right? Because it's been reduced from 3% to 2%, and that is driven by a lot of different factors. Or there's three main components that go into scarring, right? There's capital shallowing, there's total factor productivity in the labour market. Particularly on the labour market, outcomes have been far better than anyone expected, so that's meant that people could reduce that. And on the capital side, because of things like the super deduction, or the fact that we've lowered business insolvencies and investment in things like R&D and innovation has continued to be strong, people can feel much more confident that there is not going to be as big a hit to total factor productivity component of the scarring. So I think actually that's pretty good, right? And there's still room to go, right? Who's to say we can't reduce it further? So
what would you say to the IMF's global forecast that suggests the UK's recovery will lag behind other G7 nations? And also, you mentioned the OBR. Obviously, their projections are that the growth is going to go down. What is your, how do we keep up with other countries?
So actually, the IMF has us growing second fastest, I think, this year, and they're of all the numbers, they're probably the ones that have been least recently revised. So let's see what they say later this year when they do those. The OECD projections, which are more recently updated, have us growing faster than everyone else. And now, whether you look at nominal or real GDP, the catch-up that we have is squarely in line with other major economies that we compete with, so there's no major delta there at all. And whether now that is true, whether you look on nominal or real basis, actually, which is good as some of those measurement issues unwind. But what gives me confidence is, A, the plan we put in place over the last year and a half has worked. That has led to upgrades to what people thought, so I think you take some confidence in the fact that we've done a good job in limiting the damage of the last year and a half. And then going forward, I have confidence in our plan for growth. Right? I think investing in infrastructure, investing in skills, investing in innovation, those are the things that I believe will drive up growth.
So I've got two other questions. One is, are you raising taxes now so that you can cut taxes closer to a general election?
I believe me, the last thing I would do is voluntarily raise taxes. So we've had to do that to fund. We're doing that. We've done that to fund what we needed to do. Right? It's to fix the damage that coronavirus has done. It's to make sure the NHS can get the resources it needs to recover from a pandemic where the backlog was going to stretch to unacceptable levels, and to fund what are landmark reforms of the social care system, which other governments have not done. So that's why those things were done. It's a once in a 300-year economic shock. It's unsurprising that it's had some consequences.
So in terms of what you've done with this budget, women are left with £48 billion. They're poorer by your budget, according to the House of Commons Library. And £6 million families have been hit by the £20 cut from universal credit. And even though, yes, 1.9 million families will benefit from the change of the taper rate, we're going to see over 4 million children who are going to still live in poverty. And so the inequities, your government talks a lot about levelling up. The inequities have got sharper and the gender differences are even greater. What are you going to do to try and address the hit on living standards? You know, the director, you mentioned the IFS. The director of the IFS described living standards actually being awful in the next few years. How should our constituents, how can our constituents cope with all that's happened and the hit that's going to be on them, on these demographic groups that I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely right to focus on women and children. I'd say a few things. So I think that's very important, and it was in my thinking as we constructed the budget and the spending review. I mean, you talked about single parents. I think a mother's, a single parent who's working full time on the national living wage with 2 kids, renting. As a result of the change to the universal credit taper rate, is going to be £1,200 better off. So I think that's significant support. We know you talk about children growing up in poverty. Actually, there are fewer children in poverty today than there were in 2010. And we know that children in workless households are 5 times more likely to be in poverty than those without. And actually now there are several 100,000 fewer children in poverty because of that situation, which is why supporting work and making work pay is important to making sure children don't grow up like that. But I think the other thing I'd say is we did a lot to support young families and your parents with children in the early years of their life. As a result of the spending review, there's more funding going into supporting them. There's been a lot of work done about exactly where we can be helpful. So whether it's the investment in the early years workforce, £150 million to help them with professional development, whether it's the £170 million extra a year for provider rates, whether it's £200 million for the Supporting Families programme, or indeed £300 million for the set of interventions across early intervention, family hubs, parenting programmes, or the digitised Red Book. I think that is considerable support, particularly disproportionately will benefit women, that will help children. It will mean that they don't grow up in poverty.
Look, there's no question that you've been presiding over as Chancellor under incredibly challenging circumstances, and the CJRS scheme and others were very, very much what the country needed. But, earlier you were talking about speed of delivery, but the waste is something the British people should have not, the waste of public money, billions of pounds, should not have to have put up with. And now what we're seeing is that money that could have been used for, towards the levelling up agenda, for instance, and those that haven't, the numbers I've mentioned to you, the groups that are suffering and will continue to suffer because of inflation, cost of goods, fuel prices and the rest of it. So that ineffective use of public money is a serious matter, as the NAO pointed out, as Dame Angela's mentioned as well. And it's important that, frankly, a Labour government, if it presided over that kind of waste, a Labour Chancellor would have probably been hung, drawn and quartered. So the question is, what are we going to do about the millions of people who are not going to benefit from the taper? I welcome what you've done with the 1.9 or so million who are going to benefit, but there are millions of others. The universal credit cut is not going to help. And while at the same time, these other pressures are kicking in, with fuel prices and food prices going up, what will you do about them? Because the measures you've put in place are not going to reach them. And we are seeing, in constituencies like mine, child poverty has gone up to 60%. And it's hitting people very hard up and down the country. Chancellor, what are you going to do about those people?
So, you were just talking about fuel prices a lot. We've talked about freezing fuel duty, which I think Angela disagrees with.
I'm just
so
giving
freezing
you an
fuel duty will actually help all those
pressures
people.
on
And you guys might disagree, but I think that is something that will help. The universal credit taper rate, as we've said, will considerably help all those people. And the national living wage increase will considerably help all those people. And then, of course, the household support fund that we put in place before, we did it early to give people reassurance, is £500 million geared towards 2 to 3 most vulnerable families in the country, many of the people that you'll be talking about that will benefit from that. And that comes on top of many of the things we've already done. Just pick one example. One thing we did last year, which we've maintained, is an uplift in the local housing allowance, and we increased it by a considerable amount, £1 billion a year extra, which means 1.5 of the most vulnerable families are receiving over £600 a year more to help with things like rent payments. So, and those are all the reasons that actually, if you look in any of the distribution analyses, at any of the fiscal events that we've done since I've been Chancellor, what they show is a very progressive set of measures, which is disproportionately benefiting those on the lowest incomes in the lowest income decile. reconciles. I mean, those are all the things that have been published. They're all there for you to see, and that's the story that they tell, because our support has been geared towards those who need our help the most.
That's not true.
Rationale, thank you. And Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are going to start on the fiscal rules, the new ones which you introduced in the budget. I've got several questions about them. One is that you're targeting net debt, the public sector net debt, ex Bank of England, but also the rationale behind the 3-year rolling scheme. So on the public sector net debt, that's quite unusual. Normally, there's lots of different fiscal rules in different countries. We've had lots here over the last 20 years or so. Normally, the primary target is deficit rather than debt. Why have you decided to target the national debt rather than the annual budget deficit?
I mean, we're doing a bit of both, Anthony. I think, and look, one leads to the other to some extent, right? So I'd say we're doing both. We've got two rules. One is a debt target, and the other one is a deficit target of sorts. It's a current balance rule or a current budget rule, which some version of that has been in place for something like 18 of the last 25 years, or the vast majority of the past quarter century. So I think that's a reasonably common rule. I think it's reasonably accepted as being good kind of fiscal hygiene. And, I think debt is simple, it's easy to understand, and fundamentally the best protection we have against future uncertainty and shocks is just having fiscal space, and that comes from lowering our debt burden from what is a historically high level, particularly with all the risks that we've spent time talking about today. I think that is a straightforward thing for us to focus on, and that's what gives us the protection we need to think about dealing with things that might come our way. But there's one of each, so we're doing both.
So in the Office Budget Responsibility in their Economic and Fiscal Outlook report, but also in the evidence we had this morning, expressed some concern that the national debt is prone to game playing, is really one way of putting it, but concerned about like student loans, for example, the definition of what counts in the national debt and what doesn't can drive policy, so that if you have a target for the debt, that might lead your officials to advise you that some things should be counted as the debt and other things shouldn't. Is there such a risk?
Look, I think there's no perfect version of any of these rules, right? And understanding the positives and negatives of all of them, it's simple, it's easy to understand, which actually makes sense. Is it perfect? I doubt it. I don't think there's probably no rule that's perfect. Even if it didn't have that particular issue, one might rightly say, well, debt's a very narrow measure of all the financial liabilities that a government has, and we talked a little bit in there about having a slightly broader view of the public sector balance sheet, which is probably a sensible thing to do. Again, not easy to do. So we'll start thinking about that alongside debt anyway. It deals with some of the issues you talked about, but it's even broader than that. And again, it's commonly used by many countries for the reason that it is, if not perfect, probably the best thing we have that's simple, easy to understand, and broadly achieves the goal that you want. And hopefully, because of things like a suitable amount of headroom, you are not sitting there desperately trying to manage it. You should be meeting it with some room to spare in an ideal world to have that buffer. And
your target on national debt is that it should be coming down towards the end of the forecast period of 3 years. Whereas I remember when Gordon Brown first introduced a national debt target, it was 40% of GDP, I remember. It'd be nice to have such low national debt. I remember this time reading at the national debt levels of Japan and Italy, but we're now up there. Why have you decided to target simply going downwards, as it were, rather than target an absolute amount?
I think it's probably more credible. I think it's also when you talk to investors and you think about what will make us credible and what provides people confidence, the trajectory is probably more important than the absolute level, and that's something that has changed, right? And that's because the general people's perception of all these things has slightly changed over time. The 40% I think was the Maastricht rule, so I think probably was also making sure that should the opportunity arise that one might be able to take the UK into the single currency, but that's a separate discussion. I think from where we are, what people say and what matters and what I'm trying to project is people to have confidence and reassurance in the UK government, in our financing, in our borrowing levels. Having a trajectory that's clearly on a downward slope, I think, provides people that at this juncture.
You also decide to have a rolling target, so 3 years ahead, and you did touch on this earlier, that it allows you to adapt to short-term shocks in the economy. The Office of Budget Responsibility says there's a risk of it being Augustinian, by which I take to be a reference to St. Augustine, who said, Lord, make me virtuous, but not yet.
Yeah.
Isn't there a risk that if you're always targeting something 3 years away, that actually you could be very generous this year, but actually you can always plot to cut things in 3 years' time to meet your target?
That is absolutely right. And again, there's no perfect way to do these things. You can either do a rolling or you can do a fixed. Right, the problem with a fixed forecast or a fixed target is you have no flexibility, and I think people rightly would want fiscal policy to be able to adapt in the short term to changes in the economy, cyclical things that needed addressing, whilst maintaining medium-term credibility, and that's the trade-off between fixed or rolling. I think, look, if you were constantly never meeting it, that would be pretty apparent to the outside world, and you probably wouldn't get the credibility benefit that you need it to provide. So I think it's probably in practice hard to do that because people can see through it. But I think the rolling provides the right balance between credibility and flexibility. Yeah, you have another choice of timing, right? You could have a rule that was not met for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. Clearly that's not particularly credible, right? And you want to strike the right balance between it providing some flexibility but also being credible. I think 3 years strikes that balance. Once you go 5 years and beyond, it's much less credible because clearly lots can change between those times. To your point, it becomes much more pertinent if you're talking about 5-year targets rather than 3.
Yeah. And just to your point on the incentive to try and do things which shift it, obviously the closer, if you have a fixed target, the less time you have before that fixed period, the fewer levers you have to adjust fiscal policy to meet it, and therefore
to adjust.
The more likely
you
are to unconventional things.
The year before the fixed target, you'll have no flexibility at all. You have some of your sub-targets. There are 2 caps on spending criteria. So there's the welfare spending, which we've had for some time, and is sort of understandable. There's also, you now have a cap on investment, on investment to 3%. I was wondering what the rationale is for a cap on investment, since we normally see investment as a good thing.
Yes, I mean, Conrad might want to jump in. I think that represents a historically very high level of investment, and we are just under that level for the entire period of this SR and Parliament, which represents, as the highest level of capital investment sustained since the 70s, when the numbers get a bit funky because of all the nationalised industries. And it's because we have a current balance target. And to your point, people generally would have just had an overall overall borrowing target, which would have dealt with capital investment. Because we are having just a current balance target, then that's a sense of what you do on the investment side, which means that you are controlling overall borrowing. So that's our way of getting to your overall kind of nudge on borrowing, right? So there is some constraint on just aggregate borrowing. Now, look, I don't know if there's much to add.
So we should give Conrad a turn to say something.
Big moment. No pressure. Well, I was going to say, no, the 3% number, it's about double what the average as a share of GDP has been from 1980 to 2020. So it's quite a significant level of investment. And as the Chancellor's saying, it is the level which is roughly consistent with debt being on a kind of downward path when you have the current budget imbalance. So, it's a lot, but it's a sort of sustainable level of investment that you could kind of consider hovering over a long period of time, and that's one of the important things about it. I think the UK has been up at that level for 1 year or so, a couple of times in between times, but this is the largest sustained level, which is what allows you to do things like plan your kind of transport and infrastructure spending over a very long period, increase the R&D budget and keep it there, and really kind of make big changes, and fund a lot of the net zero investments which were in the budget. So it's kind of a level that is sustainable over a long period of time.
You referenced earlier that you want to monitor a wider range of metrics around borrowing and the fiscal state of the economy. And one of them is the public sector net worth. And just looking in your tables in the Red Book, that actually comes out at being, you calculate it as being, in the OBR, at minus 0.37% of GDP by 26. So that actually the net worth is negative in 4 or 5 years' time. How much, if that was a company, you'd say it should go into administration and wasn't a going concern. How much should we be concerned by the fact that public sector net worth is deemed to be going
so
negative?
we've spent a lot of time thinking through all this stuff, and Conrad and Dan will enjoy talking to you about it in a second. So I think that these numbers are new, right? And so part of the reason all of this is tricky is because it's trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. I think, again, what would probably... I'd say what are the things to get out of it? I'd say, look, there's a recognition that net debt is quite a narrow measure of the liabilities that
I fully support you looking at public sector net worth, but just wondering how much we should read into the fact
I think the things, what I would say is, what do I think about? Is like, how do we compare to other countries on an apples-to-apples basis? And it's really tricky to do, right? It's kind of harder to do that than it is to do with pure, narrow financial net debt. Now, how do we compare to other countries? And again, probably what is more important at this point is what's the trajectory, right? Is it improving? Is it getting worse? Are the decisions we're making improving it or not? I mean, that's probably what I would say. But I mean, Conrad, analytically, we've been looking at this for a little while.
Exactly. I mean, so the important thing to read into it is the trajectory rather than anything else. I mean, it is a better measure than net debt of the kind of overall financial position of the government, in the sense that net debt is blind to whether you've borrowed to consume the current spending or whether you've borrowed to build kind of railways and roads which are going to last for years. So net worth is a kind of more accurate measure of the balance sheet.
Take out a mortgage and buy a house, and the house must go your worth.
I think Dan will correct me, but I don't think it includes the future right to taxation, which is the other reason.
Yeah, it doesn't have all the asset side.
You might not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm less worried about it being.
The comparison with the company, a company can't choose to raise taxes in the future.
If only it would be a great company to run if you could dictate future revenue. I just want to finish off. I've got some questions on productivity, and the obviously one of the focuses of your budget was becoming a high productivity country, and there's I know lots of different things you're doing. You talked about skills earlier, research and investment, obviously infrastructure investment. I'm looking at the impact of Brexit on productivity, and there's various angles here. So one is that was highlighted was the OBR has highlighted is that there's it reckons that trade with the EU will end up 15% lower, or has ended up 15% lower than it was pre-pandemic, whereas the rest of the world has more or less bounced back. But they reckon that would be a 4% reduction in productivity. Do you accept those figures or recognise those figures? And do you have any idea why trade in Europe hasn't bounced back up in the way that has the rest of the world? Is that because of Brexit or other factors?
I haven't seen the latest set of trade stats, but I don't know which bit you're specifically looking at, but I'll have a look. But I think that number is an old number from them. It's not a new number. I think it was in 2018. I forget when they first did it. So it's their view of that is already in all our numbers, in all their forecasts, and has been since for a while. It was in the budget forecast that I did in my first budget before coronavirus happened. So the impact of that has already been taken into account in all their modelling.
Do you have an idea why so the trade, the OBR's got a lot about this, the trade with the EU has not bounced back as much as it has with the rest of the world? It's quite sort of noticeably different.
Well, I mean, obviously, look, our trading relationship with the EU has changed, right? Post Brexit, we have a free trade agreement, but obviously it's not exactly the same as we had before, and that means that the trade patterns are going to take some time to adjust. What you've seen, I think, is a general I haven't seen the last step from memory, but the general upward trajectory. There's obviously going to be a period of adjustment, but I think the trajectory is on an upward slope. Yeah.
And then come back to something you mentioned earlier about how you said having more high-skilled immigration. Obviously, that's an objective of the immigration policy. Obviously, there's also less lower-skilled immigration because of the ending of freedom to labour, and we're seeing all these labour shortages that various sectors are complaining about, and the Prime Minister has, something the Chair referred to earlier, the Secretary General has just pulled the lever of cheap immigration. How much impact do you think that would have on productivity, reducing the free flow of low-skilled labour?
I mean, I think the thing that's going to make more difference is on the high skill side. I think we know that there is a small number of people who can be disproportionately beneficial to company formation, company growth. To take an example, I think half of our fastest growing companies have a foreign-born founder, for example. That gives you a sense of there's a small, and those companies, by the way, disproportionately account for our economic growth. So actually, you can do some things which are not high volume in terms of the migration side, but can end up being hugely impactful to our future growth as a country. And that's why I spent a lot of my time focusing on all our high-skill migration visas, as I said, innovative visa, entrepreneur, global talent, high potential post-study and our new global mobility visa, and this new scale-up visa as well. I think those are the types of things that I think can be very, very beneficial.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Alison, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'd like to ask you, Chancellor, some questions around net zero. The world is gathering in my constituency for COP26 as we speak, but I'd want to ask you why in your budget you decided that the best way to go about promoting your net zero targets was to cut air passenger duty for internal flights.
It's not the best or anything we did. I think on that particular measure, if you look at the net impact on carbon emissions, it's at a wash, given that we also, if you're mentioning one thing we did, you're not mentioning the other thing we did, which was create a brand new rate for ultra long haul, so that the principle that you fly further away with the most carbon emissions, you'll pay more. And actually, if you look at the impact of those two things from a carbon emissions point of view, they probably just about either offset each other or a bit more than reduce.
But there's
and then just separately on that, I think what you're broadly more missing in general about net zero, not just on aviation, is just the week before budget, we announced the full net zero strategy, and that is £30 billion of investment across almost every aspect of the transition. And particularly in aviation, for example, there's £180 million to create 2 sustainable aviation fuel plants in the UK, and that is actually ultimately what we will need to do. And so there is, by the way, it's funding in the net zero strategy to actually do that.
If you're taking a long-haul flight, there aren't really very many viable options if you want to travel to Australia or to the States, but there are other options if you want to travel from Glasgow to London. Can you tell me how much the difference is between a flight between Glasgow and London, a return flight, and a train ticket?
I don't have that to hand.
I checked this morning. If you were looking to travel at the end of the month, 22nd to 29th of November, return flight from Glasgow to London would cost you £49. A train would cost you £147.80, and that's an average price. There are higher, there are lower. And the Caledonian Sleeper would cost you £435 for a return ticket. Again, I ask you, why are you cutting APD rather than taking action on train prices?
Because the action on train prices is the train network we are funding, as we talked about earlier on. Actually, we are taking enormous action on train prices, and we're subsidising the rail network to the tunes of billions of pounds a year in order to keep it running at the moment. So that's the action we're taking on train prices. And again, with regard to APD, so we've got a pro-union policy because we're returning to the system that we had, which is where you didn't have paid double APD, which is effectively what is happening currently. You paid double APD on flights within the United Kingdom. Now that didn't used to be the case, it wasn't ever the case, but we had to remove that for external reasons some years ago. So this returns it to the status quo ante, where you only pay APD the same amount. We pay half rate now on both legs. So that returns it to that system. And as I said, it's alongside a new rate for higher for longer flights, and in aggregate, I said that is either a wash on carbon emissions or reduces it. And it's also worth bearing in mind, carbon emissions from aviation are about 8% of our total, and of that 8%, less than 5% come from domestic aviation, and aviation is already covered by our emissions trading scheme. And indeed, we've invested £180 million to create sustainable aviation fuel plants, which ultimately is going to be, regardless of any duties anywhere or rail prices, given that I assume people will be flying for years to come all over the place, the actual best way to solve the emissions from that problem is trying to figure out what a sustainable aviation fuel looks like, and that's where we're putting investment. And the duties are not one way or another going to do anything.
But the point of this is, real prices are going to go up by 5% at the turn of the year. Why should real prices go up and APD gets slashed?
Again, wouldn't be for me to comment on rail prices. That's the Transport Secretary, and
you're the Chancellor. You're in charge of all the policies.
The Transport Secretary makes a statement on rail prices, as he does most years.
What I would say,
Alison, as we were talking earlier, there are billions of pounds of funding through this spending review to go on subsidising the rail network, because as you know, not as many people are travelling on it at the moment.
But that's not going to have that's not going to have an impact with respect on the prices people are paying for their tickets. The price of tickets will go up at 5% at the turn of the year.
All I'm saying is we are spending, and you know this, the vast majority of people don't use rail, right? And they're
not going to if they're going to have to pay more.
And we are already subsidising the rails network considerably. Now, you might say you subsidise it even more, so spend less on the NHS, spend less on schools, spend less on cladding, spend less on something else.
Subsidising aviation at the expense of the rail network here.
The cost of that is broadly fiscally neutral. It's about £20 million a year. Just so we're clear, it's about £20 million a year. I think Dan will correct me if I'm wrong. It's that kind of order of magnitude. We're spending billions of pounds on the rail network every year to subsidise the fact that not that many people are travelling on it. The cost of a fixed network
because it's so expensive to get a ticket.
Because a fixed network is expensive, we're already subsidising it. And you may say subsidise it even more. That's fair enough. And
would you rather
it wouldn't come from the APD. It would not come from the
ticket?
£20 million of APD. It really wouldn't. It might come from schools, hospitals. You might not want to fund roads or something else. Totally fair. But it's not, the APD has got nothing to do with the rail pricing.
Would you rather pay £50 for a return plane ticket or £150 for a return train ticket? These are the options people are weighing up.
And nothing about the change in the duty rate is make the difference between those numbers.
It's
on the rail
not going
ticket
to attract
side,
people onto the rail,
right?
is it?
The rail network at the moment is suffering from the fact that not that many people are travelling on it compared to pre-coronavirus. That is requiring all taxpayers, not just those that travel on the rail network, all taxpayers are currently contributing to a very significant subsidy of the rail network that is worth billions of pounds. Right? Because otherwise, the tickets would have to be even more expensive or services would have to be significantly reduced. So that's not happening. We are subsidising the network to the tune of billions of pounds a year currently, and our forecasts are doing so, as the Chair's questions earlier, because of the recovery in passenger demand that is forecast.
You mentioned it, you described it as a pro-union measure, as did the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the television. Would it interest you to know that 62% of people in Scotland think reducing the tax on EPD is the wrong priority for this government, more so than in the UK as a whole?
That's absolutely their right to have that view. This is a policy that ensures that travel within the Union, within the United Kingdom, is not disadvantaged relative to where it was previously.
Yeah, as long as you want to fly rather than go on a train. But
if you are going on a train, you are going to benefit from the fact that there are billions of pounds of subsidy going in this year and every year.
And a 5% increase coming in January.
And billions of pounds of subsidy.
During your speech, you said it would be reckless to have unfunded promises to abolish a tax which raises £25 billion a year when describing business rates. But by contrast, the government policy to ban new petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030 will lead to the abolition of, at today's prices, £37 billion of revenue through fuel duty. What's going to replace that funding?
Yeah, I wouldn't say anything more today than I have done previously, and that is that, of course, as we set out both in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan and in the net zero strategy last week, that, of course and obviously, revenue from motoring taxes will have to keep pace with the change in the adoption of electric vehicles. That's something that you would expect us to be thinking about. There's a Transport Select Committee currently doing some work in that space, and I look forward to seeing what they have to say.
Yes, but the net zero review doesn't identify how it's going to replace that lost revenue.
It doesn't. As I said, but obviously over time, motoring taxes will have to keep pace with changes in vehicle adoption. That's something that we have said publicly. I'd say it today, and that's kind of obvious. And as I said, the Transport Select Committee is currently doing some work. I'm interested to see what they come back with.
Mm-hmm. And are you planning a different tax?
So I wouldn't talk about tax policy here, Alison, but I am interested in the work of the Transport Select Committee because they've been looking at this very issue, and it's right that they do their work, and I'm interested to see what they have to say.
Thank you. Scotland has slightly more ambitious net zero targets than the UK. We're hoping to get to net zero by 2045, but we didn't see anything in this budget about the ACORN project, the carbon capture and storage project in the North East, which promises 20,000 jobs in the North East of Scotland. Why was that not in your budget?
Because the carbon capture and storage announcements happened the week before as part of the net zero strategy and the £30 billion of investment all across the country, and it was part of that. Obviously, I'm not in charge of deciding which clusters get picked. There's an independent process, I'd imagine, objectively, that goes through that. But what I would say is I think there are things that Scotland in particular is benefiting from in the net zero transition, particularly with regard to offshore wind, where there's more money going into offshore wind, particularly for floating offshore wind, where I think the Scottish coastline is particularly suitable for some of the new investment that it's going to go into that. Obviously hydrogen, there's money in the net zero strategy for hydrogen among other things as well.
I'm glad you mentioned offshore wind because we have to pay significantly more in grid charges for offshore wind to connect, and somewhere in the southeast of England. Can you explain how we're supposed to meet our net zero targets when it's so expensive to make wind farms stack up financially?
When you say it's so expensive, I mean, the price of offshore wind has come down dramatically over the last decade, from about £140 a megawatt hour down to 40 odd from memory. So it's actually now very cost competitive. And that the problem with and that is because many things, but technology improvements, the contract for difference system, and the challenge with offshore wind is the intermittency. But we have very ambitious plans for offshore wind. We're investing in port infrastructure, in floating offshore wind, and Conrad will correct me. But actually, to your point on grid connections, there's actually money in the spending review that BEIS will use to build better ring mains to improve some of those connections from offshore to onshore.
It's not about the grid itself, it's about the cost of connection to the grid.
Actually there is...
The Beatrice array in Murray, off the coast of Murray, pays a unit electricity price of £4.50 to connect to the grid, whereas a comparator in southern England is paid £1.50 to be part of the grid. So, how can we meet our net zero ambitions when we are penalised for having offshore wind in Scotland?
It's obviously not something that I know the detail on, Alison, so I'm happy to look at it and talk to the BEIS Secretary of State and get back to you. But from memory, there is money in the net zero strategy actually for some, from memory, for some offshore wind ring mains and things, which will help with some of the connectivity. But I said that is detail that I will talk to the BEIS Secretary of State and we'll get back to you on.
Okay, thank you very much. Why are there no measures within this budget to incentivise people to make improvements to their homes to reduce their carbon impact? For example, cutting VAT to home insulation, energy efficiency, solar panels.
Why were there not?
Why were there no measures to remove VAT from those types of improvements?
The Net Zero strategy published the week before contains billions of pounds to do exactly that across 3 different building types: social housing, public sector, and private homes. There's money put aside for doing exactly what you said, building efficiency upgrades to reduce people's energy bills. That money will be, as part of the BEIS settlement. There's 3 different streams of it: social housing, private housing, which can be delivered through local authorities as well as individually, and the public sector, as well as the Clean Heat grant, which is commonly known as the boiler scrappage scheme. And I can't remember the total, but it's over the course of the Parliament, it will probably be something like £5 billion from memory, right, Conrad?
Yes, that's right. It's about 10 billion, including the renewable heat incentive.
So that was all there. It was in the week before.
If you were to remove VAT from those measures, that would save a huge amount of money for housing associations up and down the country.
But we're doing this. We're doing the alternative thing with direct grants targeted to people who need them. Which we've had this conversation before about cutting VAT. It's about whether you want to do things in a more targeted fashion or not. There's lots of different ways to support, but as I said, we're putting in place billions of pounds to do exactly what you're talking about, which is decarbonise our building stock and tackling it through the 3 different types of buildings. We'll have 3 different programmes up and running. But again, the implementation of that is obviously for the Department for Business and Energy.
Okay. The Climate Change Committee's last carbon budget made clear that reaching net zero will be capital intensive with increased upfront spending required. Is the current net zero allocation sufficient to cover the increased upfront spending that is required?
Yeah, I believe it is. It's £30 billion over the course of this Parliament. It's very significant, covers all the major areas, and we were just discussing it outside. I think I think broadly actually the OBR's view was that it did broadly meet our commitments and would keep us on track.
Yeah, and the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change said that the Net Zero strategy was an ambitious and credible path for UK decarbonisation consistent with the Paris Agreement. So I think their view, and as the Chancellor says, the OBR in their fiscal risk report had some estimates of the amount of spending required to support the net zero transition, and said that the net zero strategy and therefore the spending review were in line with their central case.
Okay. When he was Chancellor, Philip Hammond suggested that the cost of net zero altogether could be £1 trillion. What's your estimate at the moment?
We published the net zero review alongside the net zero strategy, and actually said that at this stage it's hard to reduce it down to one single number, especially with a transition that happens over multiple decades with technologies that are evolving. But what we can do is have a credible plan to get there, which, as Dan said, the independent people think the plan is credible and it's ambitious, and we're funding it with £30 billion.
Okay, thank you. And one final thing as regards Scotland. The UK Treasury has had £350 billion out of Scotland through the North Sea oil. We're looking for money to go towards a just transition, to move Aberdeen from being an oil and gas to renewables and these new clean green technologies. The Scottish Government has put in £500 million to this effort, so we don't see the same scarring as we saw when coal fields shut across the UK. Why has the UK Government not matched that £500 million for Aberdeen?
I mean, I think at the last budget we announced funding for part of the energy infrastructure in Aberdeen to help with the transition. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but there was a project that we announced and has been fully funded through this spending review, with a particular focus on Aberdeen.
Yes, it doesn't match the £500 million just transition fund.
But we've put money into a transition deal that at least was put to us and we have funded.
Okay, that'll be that. Thank you.
Julie, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Good afternoon. I think I'm going to invite you to be slightly more philosophical. In your budget speech, you said that the Conservative Party is the real party of public services. And you also said, do we want to live in a country where the response to every question is, what is the government going to do about it? Or do we choose to recognise that the government has limits? To what extent do you accept a tension between those two statements, and how would you reconcile them?
I think the best way to reconcile them is actually the conversation we were having before, which I know is a subject dear to your heart, Julie, and that's about making sure that whatever we do spend on people's behalf, we spend it really well, and that is our job, is to do that, and that's why having a focus on delivery, on outcomes and performance, it should be at the heart of everything we do.
So to that, I mean, I've been thinking, like you say, about that. I've just released a report, which sounds like a plug, with the Centre for Policy Studies on outcomes-based approaches. How is the Treasury going to ensure that those outcomes are really measured, they're really focused on? I mean, for instance, we've estimated that in what you might call human services, so rehabilitation services, healthcare, children's services, only about 1.5% of spending is related directly to outcomes. How are we going to improve that and measure that and be accountable for that spending?
He's been waiting a really long time to talk about this.
So glad you asked.
This has been some years, by the way, because we did start work on this when I was Chief Secretary. So I'm not being light-hearted with it. You're absolutely right. It's really important. And in the first spending review in 2019 that I did when I was Chief Secretary, and I worked with Conrad on this, we started, kind of laying the foundation for a new approach, just a kind of focused approach on how do we strive for performance, how do we measure it, and how do we hold ourselves accountable and departments accountable for delivering it. But
so what we've been able to do in this spending review is set out for each department the top level outcomes that it's going to deliver for that money, and a kind of detailed set of metrics for each outcome where its kind of progress can be judged. So I've got the document here, it's online. I mean, that is what that is doing is implementing this thing, the public value framework, which the Treasury worked on with Michael Barber when the Chancellor was Chief Secretary, which is a sort of more holistic way of saying, well, how do you drive value in public services? You need clear goals, you need to be measuring outcomes, you need to know whether what you're doing is working or not. You need kind of tight control of your resources, ensuring kind of efficiency and economy in what you're spending. And you need a kind of system which is sort of resilient and learns. And another part of what we've done in the spending review has been a lot of focus on evaluation and evidence, like how robust is the evidence base that the interventions that we are funding are actually successful. We had a task force in the Cabinet Office, the evaluation task force, who came in and basically did two things: assessed the strength of the evidence for the individual bids, and where that evidence was strong, we kind of reinvested in there. And supporting families was a measure the Chancellor mentioned before that has a very robust evaluation that is actually successful at keeping children out of care and saves money for local authorities in the long term. So we funded that. But they also put in a series of suggestions or requirements for how we would evaluate the spending in future, including how could you use kind of experimental applications, randomised controlled trials, that kind of thing, to see whether kind of big ticket interventions like Help to Grow, for instance, how effective are they actually being, in order to make sure that there is that link between the intervention we are actually doing and the outcome we are looking to measure. So there's a sort of top-level set of metrics you can look at, and then more detailed evidence and evaluation by programme.
So just to give some examples then, so if we look at education spending, we know how much the children's education has been, particularly poorest children, has been impacted by the pandemic. So how will we judge the success of money, an increase into per pupil funding, for example? How will we judge the success and the milestones along the way to success?
I'll let Conrad walk you through the specific metrics that we've actually done as part of the departmental settlement, but you talk about catch-up in particular. We spent a lot of time before figuring out how much to spend and what to spend it on, and you heard me talk about it earlier, going through the evidence and saying actually, where can we look across the world at all the studies, where's the evidence point to what makes the most difference to children's learning, and that's why we zeroed in on teaching and small group tutoring as being two of the things that have best kind of bang for your buck, could be delivered, that there was a good evidence base for in the circumstances that we're in. That's why we zeroed in on those two things, as well as giving general funding to schools. But Conrad, do you want to walk through some of them?
Well, I won't read out the whole page, but it is a kind of there's a mix of both the overall indicators on the performance of the system, so level and 4 and 5 starts, GCSE results, that kind of thing, but also things like the disadvantage gap at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, because obviously a lot of the money on catch-up was focused on more disadvantaged pupils who are more likely to have lost out in the pandemic. So there's a sort of range of things. There's no one kind of perfect measure, as is always the case with public services, so you need to look at the sort of broad suite, but those are the kinds of things.
I think the one challenge, Julie, I find with this stuff is, in an ideal world, you'd run RCTs, randomised control trials everywhere. It's quite difficult to do that. We're not going to pick some schools where we're like, well, you won't get the catch-up money, and we'll have a proper control group to compare everyone to. Like, that clearly doesn't work, right? So it's a bit trickier in public policy to create as robust control groups to measure things against. When I was local government minister, I did the evaluation for the Troubled Families Programme, as it was then called, because there was kind of questions about whether it was working or not, and we had to design a kind of different way of doing that, which you can do analytically, but it took quite a lot of time working with the Treasury to design something that would actually give us confidence that the intervention was making a statistically significant difference, and it turned out that it was, but it was not straightforward to design the evaluation.
And for another example, say that we've got 5.5 million people on the waiting list for elective treatment. So significant money going into the NHS to deal with that. Do you have a specific estimate about how quickly and by how much you can really reduce that backlog with the extra funding?
That would probably be a better question for the Health Secretary than me.
Yeah.
I think if he was here, what he'd say is it's difficult for us to know because we don't have a perfect understanding of the degree of bounce back, so to speak. Right? We know there are people who have missed out on things, but you don't have a perfect understanding of how many of those people will come back into the system, and that makes a big difference to where the overall numbers end up at, say, the end of the Parliament or at any time period. What we are in control of is money going in to increase an amount of activity. Right, that's the bit that we are probably most responsible for, and you've heard the Health Secretary talk about activity levels. So all this money we're putting into the NHS is meant to generate activity levels which are X% higher than this day and Y% higher than what we did then, and that's the bit that we can do, right? So we can drive up activity and make sure every pound that we're spending is creating the most amount of activity. But in terms of the absolute backlog level at the end of a time period, it's a function of how many people come into the system, which we don't have perfect sight of, and there's quite the variation on that could be pretty huge.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Julie. Harriet.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I just wanted to go through the Red Book numbers on overseas development assistance, if I may, because obviously there have been two types of cuts to what we spend on extreme poverty around the world. There was the cut when the economy went down by 20%, which was, I think, 2.9 billion, which means that the outturn in 1920 was 10.4, so that was the first reduction. And then this year the outturn's been a bit lower, 9.7. The plans for the next 2 fiscal years are down to sort of 7.3, 8.5. Net over the full period, if we're looking at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office budget, it looks as though it has fallen something like 41% from that number before the economy contracted by 20%. And I was rather hoping that as the economy rebounded, we would see an actual increase in those numbers. And of course, the 0.7 to 0.5 cut is only 29% compared to the 41% that does seem to be showing up in the numbers. And I see you've got the unallocated provision in the 2024-2025 numbers, which are 5.2 billion. I'm just wondering, how you would even switch on something like that, given the size of the cuts that have happened.
Yeah. So I think the reason the numbers maybe don't quite add in the way you think, Harry, is probably you have to add the 5 billion too, right? Because it's sitting there as an unallocated bit, right? So then it would actually be allocated. I think the other thing is you probably can't look at the Foreign Office in isolation because ODA is spent by a range of different departments, and so the Foreign Office does the majority of it, 80% plus in those numbers, but give or take, right? But there will be a bunch that's spent in other departments as well, and the exact mix might change. In terms of the numbers, though, there should just be the 0.7 to the 0.5, and then the economy shrank. But then the ODA budget, the other slight issue, and the ODA budget we talked about was 10 billion at the time, wasn't it? Overall, when that happened, from memory. But that was the overall ODA budget. And remember, it's calendar. There's a difference between the red book numbers of fiscal year, and the ODA thing also happens on a calendar year basis, which means that there's a slight kind of mismatch between them. But in general, what you should see, and economists should come in, is what the numbers we've got in here are the 0.5 growing in line with GNI over the forecast period. And again, but that is split between FCDO and other departments. So the mix of that might be slightly different depending on the programming in any particular year or what they've decided, how they've decided to divvy up that pie. And then what you've got is the £5 billion bit in that last year, which represents the difference from 0.5 to 0.7. And again, there would be an ultimate question about how that would get allocated between departments, but I don't know, Conrad, do you want to?
So I think that's exactly right. What you're seeing over the spending review period is, as the economy is recovering pretty rapidly, so 6%,
you should see an increase.
Keeping a 0.5% of GNI means that the FCDO budget plus the other budgets around Whitehall, which are funded with ODA, go up. And then, as the Chancellor was saying, the sort of the move from 0.5 to 0.7 in 24-25 at the moment is unallocated, so that's not in these budgets, but it will be allocated if
we get there and that is what actually happens.
I think also, Conrad will correct me if I'm wrong, some of the ODA is capital. So I think the numbers that you might have been reading out were the resource style, but there's also capital where I think the FCDO budget is growing a bit more in the spending review period, excluding the unallocated amount, the 5 billion which has been added. So I think you have to look at current and capital together.
But there's nothing funny going on, Harry. I mean, it's purely, we've gone from 0.7 to 0.5 on a lower economy. It goes up as the economy grows, and then the difference between 0.5 and 0.7 is whatever is the 5 billion delta.
It just shocked me that it wasn't bouncing more as the economy, is forecast by the Bank of England to be back to where it was before by the end of this year. Perhaps you could follow up with a letter to the committee in terms of what was there before and which other departments are spending it, so that we can get a clearer understanding of it.
No problem at all.
Thank you very much, Harry. And finally, to Gareth, please.
Chair, thank you very much. Chancellor, thanks for being here. I'm going to take levelling up and take it in two parts, if I can. First on the meaning of levelling up and then the delivery of levelling up. So throughout your speech, your budget speech, you referred to levelling up on a series of announcements, including restoring culture and heritage, for example. And obviously the government has outlined that levelling up can apply to many different parts of the public policy agenda. But as you look back one day on your time as Chancellor, with levelling up as one of your key priorities in government, what is the one outcome that you would be most proud of, what you believe you should be focused on most?
Well, I think you're right, Gareth, to point out that levelling up is meant to be the golden thread that runs through the entire SR, and that's what the Prime Minister said, that's what he would say that he wanted, and I think it delivers that. And obviously that means different things in policing, from healthcare, from education to capital investment. The two things that I probably would most focus on are, one is pride in place, and making sure that people wherever they live feel that the community they live in is a richer, nicer place to live in, and the Levelling Up Fund is a good example of that. The Community Ownership Fund is a good example of that. That type of activity, and the culture, as you talked about, cultural investment, but sports investment, football pitches, all those things I think are probably in that bucket. And then the other thing is just about opportunity. And I know it's a broad word, but it's about, again, whether you're growing up in a village in the southwest, on the south coast, or up in the northeast near me, you feel that there's opportunity that's been provided for you to fulfill everything you want to do in your life. And again, that will manifest itself in slightly different ways. And if you're in Teesside, that will be about the free port and the transition to hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And it will be about the Treasury being there, right? That will make people feel that Levelling Up has been delivered. If you're in a village in the southwest, it might be about broadband in a rural area. It will be slightly different things, but it's this idea that, well, where I am, opportunity is too.
So the Treasury have outlined, though, a series of outcomes and ways in which we can measure levelling up, as I understand it in the spending review, and some of those metrics are around. I think, Conrad, you were talking about this earlier: employment, investment, output per hour. But one of the metrics is economic performance of all functional economic areas relative to the trending growth rates. And I just wondered what that meant.
Yeah, I mean, there's various things that you can look at, which are what are the trends in employment or wages or unemployment, by region. I mean, that's something that obviously we would keep an eye on. I think the good news is so far we've actually had the quite strong labour market performance that we've seen. Has been one that has been quite well experienced across the country, which is a good thing, whether it's in wages or employment growth. And again, that's the metric that is already available and one would expect us to look at. I think when people think about levelling up, they're probably not looking at that statistic. They're just going to think about their area and did I have to leave home to go get the job and have the career I wanted to, or did I get to stay at home, and is the home I'm living in, do I feel better about it at the end of a period of time?
I guess that some of the criticism from certain bodies is that you're spreading yourself too thin with the definition of levelling up, to the extent that actually it's spread so thin that there may not actually be a delivery in levelling up, depending on who you ask in the country, and that's a danger, whether it's culture or health or education or productivity. If you spread yourself too thin, you're not focused.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a mindset, right? It's a mindset across government about doing things in a way where the default is not always going to the same places that you've always done things, and just being cognizant of the fact that there's lots of different parts of the country where, by the way, we could have a Treasury office, or where you can put a free port, for example. So I think that mindset change and the changes we made to the Green Book last year will percolate down and ensure that there's just a different way of thinking about these things going forward, which will be beneficial. But I think your point is a fair one. I think the challenge is it will mean different things to people in different places, which is, I think pride of place is a reasonably universal thing, and so I think that's probably one thing, and the Levelling Up Fund can do that. But even that, in one area, will mean the high street needs to be better. In another area, it will be a transport improvement. In another area, it will be a cultural project. And indeed, that's what we saw with the Levelling Up Fund. Half of it was high street town centre regeneration, and then about a quarter each was cultural and transport. So even that, people will have different things, but they kind of got what it was about. But I think that's the slight challenge is, the things that need to improve in different parts of the country will be different.
Okay, so I think totally understand, and it is how people feel, but from an economic perspective, we have had pervasive productivity issues for decades, right? And so for a lot of bodies that monitor your work, productivity improvement is a key goal of levelling up, right? And so it was quite interesting, the Industrial Strategy Council stated that they believe that you are overly focused on infrastructure spending as part of your levelling up agenda. And yet this morning we heard from the OBR stating that it's actually not how much you spend on infrastructure, it's what you spend it on. And that we've underperformed nationally over many years in terms of the investment in stock. So I just wondered how the National Infrastructure Bank, which you announced in the previous budget, how you envisage that helping with what the OBR feel that you should be focused on.
So on infrastructure, I'd actually go a step back before we get to the Infrastructure Bank, to a National Infrastructure Commission, which is now an independent body which provides expert recommendations to the government about where is the best pound of economic infrastructure invested. So we now have a kind of independent part of the process, or quasi-independent part of the process, where someone objectively is looking at everything, saying, and we give them an envelope with which to think about, and then they come back and say, okay, these are the things that you should be doing, whether it's broadband or nuclear or flood defences or roads or rail, etc. Right. So actually, that is the part I would point you to as being really helpful in that regard, to make sure we're spending money on things that people think are sensible. I think secondly, I'd agree. Right. There's different types of infrastructure. One of the things that we have majored on in this spending review is intracity transportation. Right. So. It's clear that our non-capital cities, our second set of 7 or 8 cities, underperform relative to the average of the UK, the capital city, much more so than in other countries, and that has been a perennial issue. What's one of the reasons for that? One of the reasons for that is the intracity transportation in those places, by which I mean not the fact that they're connected to each other, but how easy it is to get around themselves from the out to the in and back, is not as good as it should be. And because it's not, you don't realise the agglomeration benefits that come from cities. Now we're starting to correct that with these intracity transport settlements, which now have a different name, which are community, what they call the comprehensive regional, anyway, CRTS. But those things is like £5.5 billion for our seven next tier cities outside London that will have the same type of TfL style funding, where there's a long-term funding settlement for those places where they can use that money to invest in intracity transportation, so whether it's metros or buses or cycle paths, whatever it might be. But that we think economically will make a big difference. That's the type of thing that we should be doing, for example, rather than some other things, but informed again by the NIC.
But in this budget, you also talked about the mobilisation of private capital and trying to bring in private investment. Is the National Infrastructure Bank seeking to do that to? Yes,
it absolutely is. I mean, it has two kind of aims. One is levelling up, and the other is net zero. Yeah. Those are ideally we try and find opportunities where it will find opportunities where it can hopefully do both, as its first investment I think demonstrates. But it's exactly designed to do that, and I think we've capitalised it with about £12 billion. We've looked internationally at what other banks have done. We think it's reasonable that institution could support total capital investment of £40 billion over a period, because it will leverage in 2 to 3 times depending on how it does. That's absolutely right, but it can help fill some of the financing gaps in some of these more nascent technologies. That's certainly been the experience of other models that we've looked at. It's new. We've managed to attract a fantastic management team. It's up and running in record time up in Leeds. It just made its first investment, and I have high hopes, as you will, for something that you called for, of what it can achieve. But as I said, I think the early signs are promising.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is why not double down on a mechanism like that to be able to mobilise private capital? You talked about 40 billion. That is a significant amount of capital and would fill any infrastructure gap that McKinsey and the like are saying that we've got. But at this budget, you announced a series of central government pots to help bring in investment capital as well. Yeah. So I'm just wondering why you did that and not.
Well, remember it's brand new, right? So we don't. It's a brand new institution. We've never had an institution like that in the UK. It's been capitalised well and can do a lot. Let's make to our point, Julie's point earlier about making sure we do things that work before that is already quite a significant start. Yeah. Let's just make sure it works and it can do what we think it's going to do, and then obviously we can have a conversation in time about what the right scale for it is. But you'd want to see that it works first. And remember, there is obviously a slight difference. It sits arm's length from ministers. And now in one sense that's good because it brings a kind of independent set of scrutiny around lending decisions and investment decisions, which has some benefit. But it's not ministers making those decisions, which is also, in one sense, that's what we're here to do, right? We're here to be elected, to be accountable for what's happening. me outsourcing the entire capital budget to someone who is not elected is probably also, that might be a bit challenging. You would find that a bit challenging probably. Right.
Gareth, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end. And can I just thank all three of our witnesses, and particularly you, Chancellor, for appearing before us. All Chancellors have challenges, but you have had a few more than most, certainly outside of peacetime. I think when you were first appointed, the virus was just beginning to circulate in China. And then you had the reality of the economy being hit by a 100-ton truck, having to put it on life support, and in particular to keep the jobs market and jobs protected. And I think, I speak for myself here, I think overall you did a fairly remarkable job in that regard. And now, of course, all people are demanding is that you go from this high debt, high deficit, high tax, low growth, low productivity, large state, with low real wage growth, huge pressures on living standards. And in the face of the threats of interest rate rises and inflation and all the other things that are lurking out there, you deliver to us a high growth, low tax, high skill, high productivity, high wage, fiscally healthy future, and that you do it all in a very fair way, if you don't mind. So that is a very huge challenge, and I think it's fair to say that whatever criticism comes your way, you have more than your fair share of challenges, and we hope that you have a bit of luck that comes your way as well in the future, and we wish you well.
Thanks very much.
And that concludes this evidence session. Order.
Thanks for having me.
Order.
Portcullis House, the Thatcher Room. Portcullis House, the Thatcher Room.